This podcast is part of the Batman Universe Podcast Network, hosted by the BatmanUniverse.net. Check out everything related to Batman and the entire Bat family at the BatmanUniverse.net, including news and original content related to comics, movies, television, merchandise, video games, and more. Also, check out some of the other unique podcasts that TBU has to offer. Consider supporting this podcast by becoming a patron on Patreon. Even $1 can go a long way in supporting this content that you enjoy. Look for a link over at thebatmanuniverse.net to offer your support now. And now, on with the show.
Hi, this is Jim Lee, and you're listening to the Batman Universe Comic Podcast.
Hi, I'm Dan Jurgens, and you're listening to the Batman Universe.
Hey, this is Scott Snyder, and you're listening to the Batman Universe Comic Podcast.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Batman Universe Comics Podcast, episode number 250. I'm your host Dustin, and I am going to be leading you through a journey through the history of the Batman Universe, as well as the comic cast, and we've got a number of different segments that a bunch of people have joined me on, that we're going to be going through and hearing some different topics that we're going to be discussing. I want to first start off by saying 10 years is a pretty big milestone, and 250 episodes is nothing to scoff at in any way, shape, or form. As you know, TBU has celebrated its 10th anniversary this past January, and kind of all of 2018 is kind of is TBU's 10th anniversary. And I myself wanted to do a bunch of special anniversary things and things like that. But as we all know, and as you've all heard over the years, it's very difficult to find a lot of extra time to do things like that. So I decided, at the very least, I needed to do something for the 250th episode. I know a lot of you were expecting something for the 200th episode, and I didn't, and I ended up pulling a fast one and renumbering everything at the last minute so that I didn't have to do anything. That was partially on par because I had very little time to put anything together, and I figured this time I really do need to spend some time putting a really cool anniversary special together. So we're going to dive into a number of things, but before I actually do that, I want to talk about kind of how TBU began for those of you who have only been around for the last couple years or even the last couple months. TBU came to be simply because I received an iPod for Christmas in 2007, and while I was trying to figure out what exactly to do with this iPod that I had not had, I discovered podcasts and went online and looked up what podcasts were and how they worked and all of that, and thought it was kind of interesting. And at the time, I had a lot of free time. I was living in Kansas, and I had a lot of free time on my hands, and that free time ended up being used for a variety of different hobbies that I had. At the time, I was ramping up my comic collection by buying giant lots of comics and taking those comic lots and then taking the things that I needed and then trying to figure out ways of selling the remaining comics that I didn't need. And at the time, I figured the Dark Knight was right around the corner. They had already started the viral marketing campaign for the Dark Knight, which if any of you remember that viral marketing, probably hands down the best viral marketing campaign that ever existed for any movie. And obviously that's a biased opinion, but at the same time, it was amazing what they did with that viral campaign. But I was extremely interested in Batman and everything regarding Batman with the Dark Knight coming out and my comics collection growing leaps and bounds. And I decided to look into podcasts to see if there was any other podcasts out there. So I searched iTunes and I came across a single podcast. It had released at that point in January of 2018, it had released 6 episodes, but the last episode had aired in October of 2007. I listened to all 6 episodes in a very short amount of time, and after I listened to the episodes, I thought to myself, well, where's the rest? I want more episodes. There's got to be some more. Well, for whatever reason, that podcast didn't end up going past those 6 episodes. Those 6 episodes was all there ever was, and I was kind of not upset, but frustrated with the idea that there's this awesome idea of somebody talking about a topic such as Batman, something that I really enjoy and love, for something like an hour, and they talk about the news and you can get up to date with all that stuff. And because there wasn't anything out there, I thought to myself, I've got some free time. I wonder how hard it is to actually record a podcast. And at the time, recording a podcast, you didn't need a whole lot. Basically, at the time, podcasts were not nearly as popular as they are now. There's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of podcasts out there, and there's tons of celebrities who have made the crossover into just podcasting and things like that. There's comedians, there's wrestlers, there's all kinds of people that are now podcasters. But back then, podcasting wasn't nearly as big as it is now. Podcasting back then basically consisted of a lot of radio shows re-releasing their recording for whatever was played on air, things like that. There was some news ones that were, strictly about that. There was political podcasts and things like that. But for the vast majority of podcasts out there, a lot of the topics that you think about now if you listen to podcasts, if you are a Disney fan or a Marvel fan or a DC fan or a film fan, there wasn't nearly as many podcasts as there is now, and it was a huge thing. There was there was some podcasts out there. Spider-Man Crawl Space was one of the podcasts that was out there that I actually used as a reference to kind of get an idea of how to go about doing something like this. There was other podcasts. I actually used that Batman podcast as a basis of what I actually should talk about and things like that too. And so basically what ended up happening was the very first podcast that I recorded, I had a simple headset mic. You don't see those nearly as much as you used to, but the simple headset mics that just have the little mic, floating in front of your face. And I used a program that I found online to record it. And I recorded the first podcast. Now, obviously, the first podcast was not the Comic Cast. It was actually the Batman Universe podcast. But that episode, when I recorded it, it was literally, I recorded it, I put it together, and I released it. The very first episode of the Batman Universe podcast officially launched on January 6, 2008. And that's kind of the mark of the beginning of TBU. Why I chose the name The Batman Universe is very simple. I've always appreciated and really enjoyed the stories that feature a wide variety of Batman characters. At the time, my favorite piece of art was the Jim Lee gatefold cover from Hush featuring all of the allies of Batman alongside Batman, because I've always believed that Batman is best with allies and with his family. And that's part of the reason why, if you've listened to the Comic Cast for such a long time, when they focus or ignore the certain family members within the Bat family, I get really upset, because that's a very crucial thing to the character. It's been something that's been crucial since the very beginning. Robin debuted just the year after Batman debuted, and there's a reason why Robin was around. And over the years, the family has grown. Jim Gordon was in the first issue with Batman in Detective Comics number 27. So there's a lot of characters that, make up the Batman universe. It's not just Batman as a singular character. So that was a very important thing, and that's one of the reasons I chose the name The Batman Universe, because the Batman Universe, it implies a lot of different things. It implies a universe full of Batman characters. It implies a universe that is Batman, that Batman exists in. It implies the overall Batman universe, such as in the way of the site, where we cover everything about Batman. We don't just cover movie news. We don't just cover TV news or video game news. We cover everything: movies, TV, merchandise, video games, and obviously the comics as well. So it was a very important thing to cover everything, not just certain aspects of Batman's world. And a lot of things back then, because there were other sites that existed back then and things like that, a lot of sites just concentrated on the movie news. And that was something that I didn't understand. I mean, The Dark Knight, don't get me wrong, is an amazing movie, is great, and the build up to that movie was amazing. I don't think I could ever experience the build up to something like The Dark Knight again, just because of how well it was done and how involved the viral marketing campaign was, or how involved I was personally with the viral marketing campaign, making my way all over the place to do certain things to just get little clips and early views of the trailer and things like that. But I couldn't believe that the only thing that anybody would ever want to talk about is the movie. I knew for a fact that there was other things that people would want to talk about. And in the early days, I can admit that, you know, outside of movie news, there wasn't a whole lot to talk about. With the comics, we didn't really start focusing on a lot of the big comic events and things like that until we got to the comic cast. Now, when I first started out, it was just me, and I was just recording just like I am here. And there's a lot of points where I listen back to some of those early episodes and I think to myself, I had no idea what I was doing, and I really needed a better mic. I mean, that's a standout thing in my mind, is that I really, really needed a better mic. But over the years, things have changed, and we brought a lot of people on. I've been very, very fortunate enough to have a lot of people who have shared my passion for Batman and have shared my love for sharing our love for the character with other people. Over the years, we've had hosts that have come and joined me on the Batman Universe podcast. Specifically, the beginning of the Batman Universe comic podcast actually started because of one person, Apple. Apple was a host that joined me early on in the Batman Universe podcast, and he suggested that there were so many comics and so much that was going on in the comic world that we make a second podcast. And at the time, the idea of doing a second podcast wasn't really that big of a deal because I had a lot of free time. Living in Kansas, there wasn't a whole lot to do. But at the same time, it didn't seem like it was completely unfeasible to do a second podcast just talking about comics and releasing it, once a month. So at the very beginning, another person who joined me in the very, very beginning of the comic cast was actually Chris. He would get the podcasts, he would edit them, and he volunteered to also do the comic cast. So we were producing on the site alone at that time, we were producing about 3 episodes per month. And there wasn't actually a site. We were actually releasing, if those of you from the very beginning remember, we were actually releasing the episodes through a website called Podomatic. And the first comic cast released on June 25th, 2008. So while you're listening to this, just 10 days away from the 10th anniversary of the comic cast. But before we actually talk about what we covered on that very first episode, I want to kind of give you an idea of how much the podcast has grown. Let's take a listen to the very first intro from the very first episode of the Batman Universe Comic Podcast.
The Batman Universe Comic Podcast.
Now, as you can see, things have changed, and as we go through the history of the podcast, we'll actually play you a variety of the different intros that we've had over the years. But you can tell that things have definitely changed since the very beginning. One of the things that we covered in the very first episode was we covered the beginning of Batman R.I.P. and Batman number 676. That was a big storyline that was happening, and it was partially to blame or to attribute, I guess you could say, to the launch of the Batman vs. Comic podcast. At the time, the Bat Books were producing a wide variety of stories that were very, very much intertwined and connected and things like that. And in the very beginning, we decided we were going to start with Batman R.I.P., and that's how it all started. So what ended up happening was We actually covered Batman 676 and 677 on the very first episode. That was something that was unique because when you think about it, Batman RIP, I mean, it's hard to believe that Batman RIP actually was 10 years ago since Batman RIP released. Now, if you remember, I said that we started the comic cast and I had a lot of time on my hands, and I honestly cannot remember why exactly this happened, but for whatever reason, the second episode ended up not coming out for almost another 3 months. The next episode didn't come out until September of 2008, and we had a slew of books that we had to cover, and there was a lot of books that we covered in the second episode. The second episode, we covered Batman 678, Batman 679, Detective Comics 846, 847, Nightwing 147, Robin 175, 176. We covered 5 different Joker Asylum titles, and then we also introduced our first segment on the podcast, which is called Short Box Collection, and this literally was a segment that we thought we needed something to fill in the time and have something else to talk about. I'm not exactly sure, considering we were recording, or when we were doing this episode, we had 12 different books that we were covering on the second episode. But the interesting thing about it is the reviews for these books were nowhere near what they are now. I mean, as you know, listening to the podcast, we only cover 2 issues per. Normally we cover Batman and Detective Comics. Sometimes there's other books, but that's the books that we do cover right now is Batman and Detective Comics, and we normally spend somewhere in the neighborhood of at least 45 minutes on those 2 books alone, talking about what happened and then talking about how we felt about the book. That wasn't something that really was really there. I can admit full well that in the very beginning I was not very good at talking about comics, and I still have certain issues when it comes to talking about the art and describing certain art aspects. I've always gravitated more towards the writing side of things. So doing something where it obviously reviewing a medium where art is such a huge focus, it is not always beneficial to be someone who strays more towards the writing side and can just look at the art and either make a comment about whether I like it or not. But in the very beginning, reviewing a book, I mean, we didn't spend more than just a couple of minutes talking about some of these books. In some cases, there was less than 2 minutes spent on each book. And it was something that obviously over the years that has the time that we spent on each book has grown. Part of the reason that we only cover 2 books now is because we wanted to talk about these books a little bit more in depth instead of just, here's what we thought, here's that's it, and we're just going to talk about it for 2 seconds. We actually wanted to discuss certain aspects of the stories and things like that. So moving along our history of the comic podcast, Chris ended up he only was around for the first 3 episodes, and then he continued to edit the podcast for a while, but it was basically just Apple and I for just a short amount of time. Then what we ended up doing was on episode 4 was the first time we actually reported some comic news. That was something where it was kind of like another one of those situations where we wanted to do a segment, and we wanted to cover other aspects of the comic world and not just here's a giant list of a bunch of comics that are coming out. The short box, we actually, surprisingly, we started that, and like I said, the intent was just to review a random book. I'm not exactly sure what the method behind that was, other than just to fill in some time, but it only lasted 3 episodes. The last short box collection was over by episode 4, and I don't honestly regret ending the short box collection. It was really just what was sitting in my box next to my desk that I was trying to, that I had duplicates of or something like that that we could just review very quickly. It presented problems because not all of us had a copy of the book, and it wasn't like now where, you could go get a copy of the book on Comixology for a low price. It wasn't like that at all. Comixology didn't exist. There was a lot of differences, but the main thing was it was very difficult to randomly have a book that not everybody could actually read themselves. So it was very difficult to actually talk about something very, very in such a random format. The first 10 episodes, surprisingly, I mean, I know that a lot of you listen to the podcast and have heard me make jokes about Stella's Batgirl Oracle and how her runtime is extremely long. our average right now for the episodes that we produce currently, so like episode 249 and the last 10 episodes, those episodes on average are about an hour and 45 minutes. And we obviously talk about comic news. We review the Batman and Detective Comics every single episode. And we talk about the other Greater Gotham books. We talk about listener Q&A. Sometimes we have a discussion. But most of the time, the episodes, they're somewhere in the neighborhood of about an hour and 45 minutes. Sometimes they're a little less, sometimes they're a little bit more. But that's the average runtime at the time. The first 10 episodes, however, despite the fact that we were covering somewhere in the neighborhood of like about 10 books per episode, the average runtime was only about 42 minutes, which, when you think about it, it just shows how much or how little time we were actually spending on some of the books that we were talking about. Just looking at some of the ones, like I said, we were only covering 2 to 5 minutes for each book, which just didn't do a lot of those books the justice that they really deserved, especially with some of the quality that some of those books actually were. On episode number 8, Nick came on board to TBU, and he made an announcement that he was going to be starting up Bat Books for Beginners, which ended up launching in episode number 9. Nick came on board as a fan of TBU and what we were doing, and wanted to figure out a way to share his love for what we were doing, as well as the Batman comics. Bat Books for Beginners was what ended up happening because of it. A lot of you may have listened to Jerry and Chris with the Bat Books for Beginners. There's been a slew of hosts that have hosted Bat Books for Beginners over the years, but it originally started as a brainchild between myself and Nick. Nick wanted to get involved in the podcast and came to me and said, I'd really like to get involved. If we were to do a segment talking about comics, what would we do? And I'm pretty sure the way it all worked out was he had the idea of starting a book or starting a series that was coming from the perspective of somebody who was a new reader. Like, what should you read if you're a new reader? And I thought to myself, that's an awesome idea, but let's take it a step farther and do it in chronological order. Because there's a lot of Batman books that have released over the years, but a lot of them don't actually focus on how to actually read the stories in a specific reading order. So we created a list, a massive list that honestly, I think it started out with 150 stories. And as you know, we are well past 150 stories. It's grown over the years, but the intent was always to have a definitive end. We were always planning on ending at a specific point. We didn't know what the point was going to be. We originally was supposed to end at Batman R.I.P. because that's what we started covering with the comic cast. But we ultimately realized that wasn't going to work because, this was later on, but we ultimately decided it wasn't going to work because in the very beginning when we covered comics, we weren't covering things as in-depth as what we would have preferred. So Batman R.I.P. was something that I wanted to recover. So the definitive end for Batman or Bat Books for Beginners was determined that it was going to end with Flashpoint. After we got to Flashpoint and covered Flashpoint, that was going to be the end of Bat Books for Beginners. And Nick was around for a very, very long time doing the podcast. Eventually, he had to move on to other things and hand it over to John. And John took it over for a long time, and then Melissa joined him as well. And then we eventually went into having two guys from the Arc Reactions podcast, John and Dylan. They actually came on board. For over 2 years, they ran Bat Books for Beginners, and that eventually led to Jerry and Chris taking over, and they're doing it now. And hopefully they're able to stay on board until the series wraps up. But it still has about a year and a half to go before we eventually get to Flashpoint, just because we've made sure to fine-tune the stories that we covered and, make sure we cover a lot of stuff. And you'll notice that as time goes on, in the very beginning of Batman's chronological history, you don't have as many titles to cover as you do the more recent history, because it's a lot easier to put books like Nightwing and Robin and Birds of Prey and Batgirl into certain aspects of a reading list when you have them collected in the format they're collected. Also, it has to do with the fact that there's a lot more series that existed in the present day rather than in the early days. So That was a big thing, and Bat Books for Beginners has been a very successful thing over the years. Regardless of who has actually been running Bat Books for Beginners, it's always had a fair number of listeners, and we always get people who are saying, what do I do if I've never read comics? And we always suggest check out Bat Books for Beginners because it's a great way of taking a look at a number of stories. Bat Books for Beginners started out as a segment on the Comic Cast and was only 5 to 10 minutes long, depending on the books that Nick was covering in the very beginning. And now it's grown to, normal episodes are about 45 minutes long, just to be able to cover a little bit more in depth. And again, it just shows that over the time, the podcast has evolved, and we have, given more coverage to the stories and the comics that we've done. Also on episode 9, Josh Bertoni joined us. Now, many of you know Josh Bertoni from the Gotham Chronicle, but he started out actually as a host on the Comic Cast. And this was still early on in the days of the Comic Cast. And Bertoni basically just emailed me, said he was very interested in what we were talking about, and he had recorded different episodes and been involved with Spider-Man Crawlspace in different aspects, and he also really liked Batman on top of Spider-Man, and he came on board, and I have to say, if it wasn't for Bertoni, a lot of other people that from the Batman universe probably I would have never even come across them. I myself have been I'm a very solitaire person where I don't branch out and I don't really talk to a lot of people. It's just my type of personality, which it's not always the best when you're talking about, having a podcast and having different ways of communicating with the fan community. I've not always been very good about this, but over the years, Bertoni has actually helped bring on a number of different people, including Don and Stella, and he's helped with other major aspects on the website and the podcast and trying to grow the site. He has helped at San Diego for years and years and years. Bertoni is a very, very important instrument in bringing in and furthering what TBU actually does. So he came on episode 9, and that was in December of 2008, and around the exact same time it was actually a couple months before that, but we launched the BatmanUniverse.net, and originally it was supposed to be the BatmanUniverse.com, a word of wisdom out there. If you're ever trying to create a website, don't go to a place that'll create a website for you and let them purchase the domain for you. Originally it was supposed to be the BatmanUniverse.com, and I went to a firm who was going to build me a website because I have no knowledge. Just to put in perspective, so those of you who understand my skill levels, I previously in my life have worked a number of jobs, but most of them are physical labor. The vast majority of them are in labor in some way. But I was in the military. I worked at Target as a manager. I worked at Blockbuster. I worked at Best Buy. Prior to the actual podcast, though, I was still in the Army at the time. But the thing is, my skill levels were more about labor and physical skills. I've been a handyman. I was handyman for a business, and actually in the final part of when I was in the military, I was in charge of the buildings that the soldiers were actually sleeping in and things like that, and maintaining those buildings and things like that. So those were my skills. I didn't have any skills about audio editing or podcast creating or website development or graphic design or any of this stuff. I didn't have any knowledge or really a knack for creativity per se. Obviously I can talk, and I've always been able to talk and tell stories and things like that, but for the vast majority of what I've done over the years, it's always been physical type work. It was never really anything creative in any way, shape, or form. So creating a website, I needed to find somebody to help me do that. Again, Apple was instrumental in bringing the Batman Universe site to be, because he specifically said we needed to have a site that we could connect with fans and things like that. And if you remember in the very beginning, we had a forums section where we had a number of fans who were talking about Batman all the time. It's one of the things that I wish we could bring back nowadays, but forums nowadays are not nearly as popular as they used to be. But it was one of those ways where it was easy to connect with fans and talk with fans. So it's one of those things where I wish we could bring it back. I just don't see it happening anytime soon. But in the very beginning, we had to create a website, and in the process of creating a website, I needed to find somebody, and I found a firm who said, "Oh yes, we'll set it all up for you." And when you hire somebody to do something, especially on the internet, and you don't have any sort of agreement other than an email, it's very easy to lose things. So, for example, this firm, they actually registered the BatmanUniverse.com, and then in the process disappeared and didn't actually do what they were supposed to do. It was very frustrating, but it ended up mutating then into the BatmanUniverse.net, specifically because I couldn't get the .com at least for another year, and I wasn't going to put off making the website for another year. Part of the other reason for the website was Podomatic at the time. We were getting a significant number of downloads from the stats that they were providing us, and the stats that they were providing us showed that our bandwidth levels were getting to a rate where we needed to find some other way of hosting the website or hosting the podcast, because it was becoming way too expensive just to have the episodes on. This was also during the absolute height of the Dark Knight and Batman during 2008, where everybody was searching for stuff related to Batman. And as part of the reason why we were very successful in the very beginning of the podcast is because there wasn't anything else out there. Nobody else was talking about Batman, and we were producing episodes at least once a month, in some cases 3 times a month. And we had content that people who were learning about Batman for the first time after seeing The Dark Knight, or fans who elapsed their fandom, were coming back into it. So they all came in and they were listening to the podcast, which blew us up really quickly. But at the same time, we needed to build, and that's how the site came to be. In episode 18, we got a brand new intro. So let's take a listen to that one.
Hey, this is Will Procasio.
Hi, this is Brian Azarelli.
This is Freddie Williams.
Hi, this is Libra Mayo.
Hi, this is Matt Wagner.
Hey, this is Tim Sayer.
Hi, this is Nedja DeFilippis.
And Christina Weir.
Hey, this is Ethan Van Skybro.
Hey, I'm Dustin Wynn. Hi, this is Kevin Van Hook, and you're listening to the Batman Universe Comic Podcast.
So as you can see, it's a little bit different, but it's not that much different. And honestly, it's still, in my opinion, pretty bad. But I can say that because that was content that I created. Now, if you listen to a lot of the podcasts in the very beginning, I spent a lot of time preparing for this 250th episode by going back and listening to a number of the episodes. And part of what I have found was that the audio levels in the podcast absolutely suck. And I remember in the very beginning, there was people who actually sent in comments that said, your P's and T's and S's, they all sound horrible. And it was really because my microphone was a cheapy microphone. I didn't have the funds to go buy a super fancy microphone, because at the time, like I said, podcasting wasn't a huge deal like it is today, where you can get a really good microphone for just $100. Back then, if you wanted a quality microphone, you had to spend hundreds of dollars to get a quality microphone, because there really wasn't anybody from the professional level of like radio to the hobbyist of just somebody playing a game on the computer and needing a microphone. There really wasn't anything in between that was super affordable. So I have to point that out. If you do choose to go back and listen to some of the old episodes, I apologize, because those audio levels were absolutely horrible. A lot of the episodes we were editing certain aspects, but we didn't know how to do other things like level the audio, remove some of that background noise and things like that. We do a much better job with a lot of that now. Obviously, we still have issues here and there, but the ultimate thing is that it's changed a lot for the better over the years when it comes to the audio levels. Finally, on episode number 30, I got a new mic, and the mic actually sounded a lot better. It was actually a standalone mic that I found that, again, like I said, it was something that I was able to find, but it was something that it took me a while to find, and something that wasn't too expensive. So that microphone I actually had for a pretty long time. I actually had that microphone for about 3 years. It actually moved with me back to Illinois when I moved back to Illinois. And I had that until my son actually broke it. He unscrewed something, and it literally fell apart and smashed on the floor. And I had to get a new mic, and I've had the mic that I have now since I think 2012 is when I bought it. And at the time, it was like a $120 mic. My wife thought I was nuts for buying something as expensive as $120 for a microphone. But I thought it was a good idea because, honestly, the better the mic, the better. And it's been a good mic. It's a lot of you may in the podcast world may have heard of the Blue Yeti or use the Blue Yeti. It's a very common microphone that you see YouTubers use as well now, but it's something that has been very reliable, and I've been using it for a very long time. So just running through some of the other stuff. In episode 33, we had Zach join. Zach, again, he was on a number of episodes. He covered a lot of the stuff leading up to Flashpoint and things like that. We had other guests that had joined us over the years. In episode 40, though, this was March of 2010, we then got another new intro. So let's take a listen to that.
Hey, I'm Dustin Wynn. This is Freddie Williams.
This is Ian Sattler, Senior Story Editor at DCU.
Hi, this is Lindsay DeFilippis.
And Christina Weir.
Hi, this is Kevin Vandal.
Hi, this is Libra Mayo.
Hi, this is Brian Azarelli.
Hi, this is Matt Wagner, author of Batman and the Monster Man and Batman and the Mad Monk.
Hey, this is Mike Martz, Batman Group Editor.
Hey, this is Ethan Van Skybro.
My name is Neil Adams.
This is Paul Dini.
This is Robert Greenberger.
This is Jerry Robinson.
Hey, this is Will Pertaccio. This is Adam Beechin, and you're listening to the Batman Universe Comic Podcast.
All right, and then episode 48, just moving along, was the first time we actually had an episode that had to get split into two because there was just so much content that we covered. So there was 2 episodes there. In episode 47, which was July of 2010, Don joined us. And Don, again, has been a guy who has been very instrumental to a lot of the stuff that we've done over the years. Don came by, as I said earlier, as a suggestion from Josh, and he also came from Spider-Man Crawl Space and had worked with them in the past and found out about the Batman universe because of what Josh was doing and things like that. And he came on board and joined us, and he had a pretty long run too. Outside of myself, Stella, and Ed, Don has had the longest run of being on the comic podcast with 67 episodes. And Don filled in initially as a last minute fill in because we needed somebody to join us, and he just kind of stuck around, and thankfully he has still stuck around. He runs the Batman Universe commentaries. Any of the commentaries that are currently coming out, he organizes those. He also obviously is part of the Gotham Chronicle podcast, and he writes articles on the site as well. But he also is very instrumental in our San Diego coverage. Him, Josh, and Stella have been covering San Diego for a number of years. After I had children, I had to pull back on being able to go to San Diego just because of the cost and the amount of work that actually requires you to do at San Diego. It's almost not beneficial to be in San Diego if you're trying to write up news stories and things like that. It's almost easier just to do it from your home and report the stuff that people are feeding you. So they would give me information. I would post up on the site and things like that. But ultimately, it came down to, the three of them have had a really good. The three of them have had an amazing friendship that has, I know that for years they treated San Diego as like the time the three of them all got together, and they have done an amazing job of covering the convention and bringing you all kinds of interviews and news and things like that. So again, Don, just like Josh, has been very instrumental to a lot of the stuff that we've been doing, has been around for a very, very long time. So just moving along, we're going to probably start going through a little bit quicker with some of these updates, but episode 60, Joe Jinks joined us, and Joe was a guy from England who joined us, and it was interesting because at the time when he joined, he was actually in high school, and he figured out a way to record the podcasts when it was like 2 a.m, because we always recorded at night back then, and he would record the episodes basically in the middle of the night. He would wake up from sleeping, he would record the podcast, and he would go back to bed before he'd have to get up to go to school. And it was real dedication, because he recorded the episodes, and in some cases, if we had really long episodes, he didn't even have the time to go back to bed before he'd have to go to school. So Joe, I still keep in contact with Joe. Joe actually puts together some of the graphics that we have for certain aspects. He puts together the Gotham Chronicle cover art, and he works on some other graphics that we occasionally need. But Joe was around for 58 episodes, and that was a huge chunk of episodes as well. So moving along, in episode 62, we introduced a segment called Bat Book Delays. Now, if you've been around the comic world for a long time, this was in 2011, there was a point where books started to get delayed insanely frequently. Books were getting delayed over and over and over again, and it didn't seem like there was any rhyme or reason other than something inside of DC editorial had a massive issue with getting stuff out on time. You see this occasionally now, but if you remember correctly, in the beginning of the New 52, one of their sticking points that they wanted to make sure didn't keep happening was the delays. So even though we introduced an entire segment talking about the books that were delayed and when they were actually going to release, it turned out that just a couple months later, with the launch of the New 52, DC actually said that they didn't want to keep launching stuff late. Now, that's not to say that DC doesn't release stuff late. We've seen, like we've talked about on the podcast, Doomsday Clock moving from only having 2 months off in the midst of their 12-issue run to having to change it to every other month releasing a new issue. That can be frustrating, but it's not nearly as bad as it was back in 2011 when books were getting delayed left and right, and you'd have a book that would be, it's just coming out a week later. This one's coming out 3 weeks later. This one's not coming out till next month. It was happening a lot, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, you could definitely go back to episode 62 of the Batman Universe Comic Podcast and take a listen to the segment for Bat Book Delays. On episode 75, which was in September of 2011, Josh actually chose to leave the comic cast, and this was directly related to the fact that the New 52 started. The New 52 was announced in May of 2011, and when it was announced, if you remember correctly, we actually had a special that we released. It's not actually part of the comics feed, which nowadays it would be, but as part of the Batman Universe specials, we actually released a episode where we had like a big round table of people talking about the big announcement of the New 52 and the potential reboot of all the books and things like that, and the books that were announced and the creative teams that were announced, and we were talking about all that stuff. And at the time, there was a lot of people who were very upset by the idea of the New 52, and part of the reason behind that was because the New 52 was meant to be this thing to draw in new readers, but they were ignoring all their current readers, and DC has realized over the years that was a misstep, and Rebirth kind of brought the aspects of the history and the continuity of the characters back into it and stopped ignoring the readers who have been supporting a lot of these books for years and years and years. But Josh was very upset about the idea of the New 52, and he decided that he wasn't going to continue on with the comic cast because he didn't want to keep talking about the comics at the time. So it was kind of interesting at the time when Josh chose to leave, because he had a massive reasoning behind this. So take a listen as to his reasoning.
I've just been feeling really, really conflicted ever since they announced the new DC stuff. And I've kind of gone back and forth on it. And there's been a lot of things about it that have seemed disingenuous to me. And I'm not going to get into too much of it, but basically I realized that I was, not going to be reading a lot of the new DC stuff. And honestly, I'm going to check it out over curiosity purposes, but I wish them luck in what they're doing. I really do, because if this thing works out, this can be great for comics, comics can become more mainstream again. That would be a great thing. And for that, I wish them the success. I don't like that they're erasing some history stuff, and I don't like that they're being disingenuous about it, and by saying everything's the same, but then they're giving these characters new origins and saying that it's not the same, and those solicitations are saying meet Catwoman, meet Supergirl. That's the type of stuff, and when it does that, it's telling me I'm not the intended audience anymore. They're after a new audience. And it's like, if I'm not the audience, then what am I doing? And it's really, really hard to go cold turkey, so I'm going to be checking out these comics, but because of how I feel about them right now, I don't feel it's appropriate for me to review them on the comic cast. I don't know. I don't feel that I can be objective over them at the moment. And, who knows how I'll feel 6 months or a year from now or 10 years from now or something. But right now, I need to take a step back, and let this new DC settle and see how I feel about it,
So with episode 76, which was the episode right after Josh left, we had our very first episode that covered the Batman, or the New 52, that is. This was the first time we had 5 co-hosts at once joining us. So at the time, it was myself, Joe, Don, Stella, and then John Wilson actually was joining us as well. And the 5 of us were talking about the New 52 books, and we were covering a lot of books again, because there was a lot of books initially that launched with the New 52. But there was some of these episodes were extremely, extremely long, and John ended up staying around for about 5 episodes. Stella obviously has stuck around for a very, very long time. Stella came to us from Batgirl to Oracle. So Batgirl to Oracle was a podcast that originally Stella started on her own somewhere else. I was pointed to her podcast by Josh. Again, like I said, Josh has pointed me in a wide variety of different directions as to, certain people who could have really high potential to be part of the Batman universe. And I listened to Batgirl to Oracle, and Stella ended up bringing Batgirl to Oracle to the Batman universe. And she has been doing that podcast for a very long time. But eventually we started to talk about different things, and she was interested in the comics, the current comics as well. And at the time she was covering the comics that were coming out, but she was also covering, a lot of the older comics, a lot of the Barbara Gordon stuff, her early days. So when the New 52 launched, I asked Stella if she wanted to come on board and join the comic cast. And Stella has actually had the most episodes besides myself that anybody's ever appeared on when it comes to the Batman Universe comic podcast. Out of 250, she's been on 3/5 of those episodes. That's insane. So Stella, like I said, Batgirl to Oracle is probably, outside of the comic cast, Batgirl to Oracle is our second most popular podcast. At a time, the Batman Universe podcast was very popular, but as you know, that's been on hiatus for a couple of years now. But Batgirl to Oracle has been an extremely successful podcast and has brought in other listeners who wouldn't have otherwise heard of us. Stella has done an amazing job networking with other podcasters, and it comes down to there's certain people that are very good at networking, and there's certain people like myself that aren't very good at networking. So finding the right people to network with other people, and then to have content that is extremely popular, like Batgirl Oracle, is something that I have been very fortunate and lucky to have. But Stella being on as many episodes as she has, I mean, she's been around for the horrific New 52 stuff. She's been around for some really good stuff over the years. But Stella has always been the light and airy, charming person that we really needed for the podcast, because a bunch of dudes who just complain about comics isn't always super fun. And she, in a lot of ways, was able to find certain elements that, were highlights and things like that, and point good things out. In some ways, she was the ray of light, or the ray of sunlight that the darkness that the TBU Comic Cast was really needed. So much appreciated to Stella for all of her work over the years, including helping out at San Diego over the multiple years. In episode 100, during the announcements, we talked about the anniversary, and we talked about the fact that we were around for 100 episodes. But ultimately, what it came down to was, it was just a brief mentioning of kind of the history of the podcasts, not nearly as detailed as what we're doing now. And the idea behind that was, I was never somebody who really wanted to celebrate huge milestones. Episode 100, episode 50, episode 200. It was nothing that none of those were things that I really wanted to go out of my way to really point out, because I just always treated it as, if you're a TV show, 100 episodes is a big deal. But if you're like a news show, or a show that's on regularly, like something like, I guess, a newscast or something like that, you don't really celebrate how many times you've been on the air. You just keep going. You just keep going, and you just keep doing what you do. And that's kind of how I always viewed it. Episode 250 is obviously an exception because of two reasons. One, because it's the 10th anniversary. And two, it's because it's episode 250. And another reason is because I've promised that I was going to do something special, and I just kept putting it off. So, it was a big deal to do something like that. In episode 101, Josh actually returned, and he came back to basically talk about some of the comics, but also rant about the New 52 and how everything was playing out. And he actually pushed our runtime to over 4 hours, which was the first time that ever happened. Our episodes had gone over 3 hours in the past, but 4 hours was something that was never done before Josh came back for that one episode. In episode 104, we actually started trimming some of the books, and this was specifically due to two reasons. The first reason being the fact that we had so many books and we had so many things to actually cover per episode that it was getting almost too hard to edit a podcast that was 3+ hours every single 2 weeks, just because of the number of books. The other reason was because there was a lot of secondary books that just were not very good. Not very good at all. And we didn't want to just keep covering the stuff that was really, really bad. Despite the fact that we were covering all of the Batman universe. At the time, it just wasn't something we wanted to keep doing because of how bad some of the titles actually were. In 2013, you may remember the Don and Stella wedding. That was a April Fool's joke that was released on the Batman Universe specials, but we highly promoted it on the Comic Cast, and it was a unique thing. It was one of the first things that a lot of the hosts on the website actually took part of, and were had certain aspects and things like that. And again, that was all put together. Just because of Don, Stella, and Josh having this crazy idea to do something unique for April Fool's Day. And even though I don't really do any April Fool's Day postings on the website, we still almost every year have some sort of April Fool's podcast, either with Backle the Oracle or the Gotham Chronicle, that releases something related to April Fool's every single year. So check them out if you haven't. There's some crazy things that have happened over the years, so definitely check some of those out. In April of 2013, this was the point where we started the Point 5 cast. The Point 5 cast, as I said earlier, was something where, so as I said, episode 104 we started trimming books, but by episode 113, which was just a couple months later, there was a point where a number of listeners were sending us messages saying, we're really upset that you're not covering all of the books. We understand that some of them suck, but we really want you to be covering all of the books. And the answer to that was there was no way we could have the normal episodes stay at the runtime that they were, with over 3 hours long, and keep getting them released on time. So the solution we came up with was, let's create the 0.5 cast. And 0.5 cast would cover anything that wasn't a Batman book. And at the time, the Batman books that were releasing were Batman Detective Comics, Batman the Dark Knight, and Batman and Robin. Those were the 4 Batman books. There was other miniseries and things like that, but those were the 4 main Bat books. But then there was a bunch of other books that were releasing, like Batgirl, Nightwing. So at that point, Ed joined us. Now, Ed has been around for over 106. He's been around for 106 episodes up to now. Obviously, he's still on the podcast as one of my co-hosts. But Ed has been on the podcast for a long time, and Ed coming to the podcast actually stemmed from him guesting on Batgirl the Oracle, and Stella reaching out to me and saying, "Hey, you've got to get this guy because he really belongs on a podcast. He can talk about comics really well. You need to reach out to him and get him on." So I reached out to him, asked him if he wanted to join. He was thrilled about coming on board, and he's been on board ever since. He's been around for over 5 years now. And Ed, to his credit, probably deserves way more credit than he ever gets, because when he initially joined, he was with myself, and we were covering horrific, and I mean horrific, stuff in the very beginning with all the secondary books and the quality that some of that stuff was. It was really, really, really bad. Some of the stuff that we were covering, so bad so that just a couple months after that, when we released episode 123.5, Catwoman was so bad that month that we actually interrupted our intro talking about how bad it was, which that was not something we did very often, where we would have something prior to the actual intro starting off. It was something that would just, the intro would happen and then we would get into talking about it. But it was so bad that we had to preface the episode with, "This episode was so bad, we're so regretting having to cover this episode." That was something that Ed deserves a lot of credit for over the years. He has been around for a lot of stuff, but he initially came on board and was covering the worst of the worst when it came to the books to cover. And he stuck around, and now he obviously helps cover the good stuff, like Batman and Detective Comics, and obviously a lot of the good stuff that we talk about in Greater Gotham as part of Rebirth. In episode 124, we actually had 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4 episodes, and this was to mimic what was going on with the DC Villains Month in September of 2013. This was actually broken down where we had a weekly comic cast, where every week we would have a new episode talking about the villains issues that released those episodes. Also, with the 124 episodes was the final episode that Don was around. Don left around that time. Shortly after, Joe left in April of 2014, and then Ed became full-time on the podcast, taking over the spot that Joe left. So then at that point, it was Ed, myself, and Stella who was left on the podcast. Episode 134 was the very last time we had Bat Books for Beginners on the podcast. We actually had a brand new intro that we launched when right before Ed came on board, and we had a relaunch format, which was the idea of taking Bat Books for Beginners out. Bat Books for Beginners was getting longer. Each episode was getting longer, and we decided to spin it out into its own podcast at that time. Mostly for 2 reasons. And I know I keep saying mostly for 2 reasons, but the 2 reasons were the episodes were getting longer and getting better in quality, but plugging that into an episode like the Comic Cast, which was already very long, we needed to get that runtime for the Comic Cast down. And I know that there are people out there who have absolutely no problem with 4-hour-long podcasts, would appreciate 4-hour-long podcasts, but the problem is to actually produce a 4-hour-long podcast every 2 weeks is extremely difficult to do. Between the actual recording, prepping for a podcast of that length, and then obviously the post-production with editing and things like that. And there is a massive amount of work that goes into editing a podcast. If you've never edited a podcast, you probably have no idea what I'm talking about, but let's just put this in perspective. You have a 2-hour podcast, and you are able to sit down and just edit it nonstop. You would be lucky to get it done in about 3 to 4 times that amount of time. So a 4-hour podcast, you'd be lucky to get it done in anywhere between 12 and 16 hours. And that's like nonstop. You know, you don't have a lot of breaks in between. And it was just unfeasible to keep having it. So Bat Books for Beginners spun out into its own feed, which in some ways was a lot better for it because it was able to be something that was out there that people could listen to and just listen to, you know, the chronological format for the Bat Books by themselves and not have to listen to all the older episodes of the Comic Cast. So that was a great idea that happened. In episode 135, like I said, Ed joined us full time, but that also was the launch of our brand new intro. So real quick, let's listen to that intro.
The Batman Universe Comic Podcast. Hey, this is Scott Snyder.
Hi, this is Denny O'Neil. My name is Neil Adams.
And this is Paul Dini.
Hi, my name's Dan DiDio.
This is Kevin Conroy.
Hey, this is Francis Maniple.
Hi, this is Jim Lee, and you're listening to the Batman Universe Comic Podcast.
With that intro, we also had a new format that we covered with the way we covered actual books individually and things like that. That was something that we introduced. Later on, about a year later, Convergence was happening, and this was one of the first times that I actually took a break from the podcast, mostly because I had a lot of different things going on at the time, having this opportunity such as Convergence where stuff wasn't really affected by them, or wasn't really affecting the main continuity and things like that. I thought this was a perfect time for me to take a break. Stella also took a break with me, and Ed actually headed up the Convergence episodes, which again, Ed just ends up getting stuck with the worst of the worst when it comes to the books, because most of you who have read Convergence know that Convergence was not really the best thing in the world. A lot of the Convergence titles were kind of giving us peeks at what we remembered from pre-Flashpoint, but ignoring a lot of the other aspects that we really wanted, and giving peeks and not really recognizing everything else was kind of unfortunate. Don actually came on to do those episodes along with another host, Josh Paul, who came on to cover the Convergence episodes as well. Some of the other specials that we've had over the years, Robin War happened, and that was Robin, Terrence, and Olivia covered Robin War for us over on the podcast. Those were released as separate episodes, mostly because the vast majority of the books that they were covering, we weren't covering on a normal basis. So so Rob approached me and said he really wanted to cover Robin War. So that's how that came to be. Episode 185, that was Ed and myself doing the DC Rebirth live reaction. The DC Rebirth panel at WonderCon that year, when they announced that was something that we watched and gave our feedback on as they were making announcements. It's one of my most enjoyable comic casts because, one, there wasn't really anything to prep for, and really we just had to sit there and watch a video and then talk about it. And obviously that's very similar to something like a commentary or something like that. But I think Rebirth was a moment of joy for a lot of fans, including myself, because Rebirth was something where it was DC acknowledging that they made mistakes. And during that panel itself, they said flat out they made mistakes, and they were ignoring certain groups of fans that had been around for a very long time. And it was good to see a company like DC actually recognizing that there was an issue and that they needed to change, and that Rebirth was their answer. A lot of the books they announced were exciting, and the ideas that of what we were going to get was very exciting. So it was one of my most enjoyable episodes I think I ever did, just because it was just getting a bunch of really cool, good information and just being able to chat about it as it happens. In episode 200, we talked about leading up to episode 200, Stella had said we should do something special, an anniversary special or something like that. And I kept saying, yeah, well, maybe we'll just do a segment talking about something related to the fact that we've been around for 200 episodes. And I kept saying that, and the next thing I knew, it creeped up on me and episode 200 was there, and I had nothing planned. So I just decided, as we're like pretty much 30 minutes before we started episode 200, that I was going to go through and count the episodes that we've released so that I could get a actual number of what episode we were. And then I just decided, you know what? Okay, so we actually would be at 212 if we counted these other episodes. So if I counted all these other episodes, well, then we're at 212. So we're just going to renumber. So that's what happened. We renumbered 212 to take all of those 0.5 casts and the 0.1, 2, 3, 4 episode for the Villains Month, and some of the other stuff that we released, some of the other extra episodes, and just pile them all into one finite number so that we would have a definite number. And a lot of people were disappointed about my explanation as to why we were renumbering and things like that instead of just doing some sort of anniversary thing. But again, it just comes down to, like I said, I'm not really somebody who really does a lot of milestone type situations. Like, I've never really been someone who likes to toot my own horn. There's never an occasion that I don't like to do that. But the vast majority of the time that I've been with TBU, I don't really like to sit there and say, we're the best. We've been around for so long. We are, the longest running Batman podcast, because we are. This podcast is the longest Batman podcast that exists. We're not the first, and I have no problem admitting that, because the podcast that was first, the first Batman podcast that was out there, was something that, gave me the idea to really do this and have this become what it was. But we are the longest running Batman podcast. There's a lot of other podcasts out there that have released episodes and have been around, but none of them have been around for as long as we have been. With even this podcast launching in June of 2008 has been around longer than any other podcast that is out there right now that's still producing episodes. So that is a milestone in some ways, but it's a milestone that doesn't change. As long as we keep producing new episodes, we just continue to be the longest running. It's like The Simpsons being the longest running series of all time. We're that, but for Batman podcasts. So in episode 217, which was released in February of 2017, it was very Lego themed. We had a Lego intro, Lego cover art. That's because the Lego Batman movie came out. A lot of you may not know this, but I am a huge Lego fan. I have a massive, massive Lego collection that I have pretty much all of the Lego, anything that has Batman, Lego Batman related, DC Comics superheroes, I've got pretty much everything. The only stuff I don't have is the initial series of sets that came out in 2007, because I didn't get into collecting the Legos until about 4 years ago, and when I did get into collecting them, those were already extremely expensive. But I have a massive collection, and it's been hard to keep up at times, especially with the Lego Batman movie coming out and releasing a bunch of extra sets that wouldn't have otherwise released. But I have a massive Lego collection. I'm a huge Lego fan. So outside of Batman, Lego is probably my second biggest interest outside of Batman. And it's a huge thing. So when the movie came out, I was really pumped to see the movie and thought, let's do something special for the release of the movie. So that's what happened in episode 217. In 218, I introduced a little segment called Monkey Watch. Now, Monkey Watch was literally just something that I was just trying to mess with Stella, because Stella over the years has tried to she has been very good at pushing my buttons when it comes to certain things. Early on, she used to bring up Marvel a lot, and when she would bring up Marvel, I would always be typing in the chat window, "Stop talking about Marvel. We're not here to talk about Marvel." And now it's not as big of a deal, because when we do talk about Marvel, it's in relation, or we're relating it to something that we're already talking about, which is what she was doing. But I was a very big stickler when it came to certain things, and I didn't want to talk about Marvel or Marvel characters, because the problem is, if you're listening as a Batman fan or a DC fan, you might not have any idea what Marvel's producing or what Marvel's doing, or you might not have ever read any Spider-Man comics, and relating it to something like that is Marvel instead of relating it to something that's DC, you might not have any idea what we're actually talking about when we're relating it to that kind of stuff. So it's one of those things where I was very big stickler about it, and she loved to make references to it because she loved to push my buttons, and over the years she's pushed my buttons probably more than anybody, but it was all in great fun. So I figured, because she thought that it was almost impossible for me to just do anything that was completely crazy, I decided to introduce a segment called Monkey Watch. And Monkey Watch was literally me just talking about monkeys that were popping up in pop culture or comics, and that was the entire idea. And I thought to myself, I didn't even know what I was doing, and when I was editing the podcast at the time, because I was actually editing the podcast, I put together a unique intro for Monkey Watch, and thought this will just be one of those weird segments that we have. And the intent was to actually keep it around for a while, but I kept forgetting about it. And at the time, there was a bunch of stuff that actually happened last year that I wish I would have talked about. Kong Skull Island came out last year, and that was a movie that I saw, and that actually came out just a month or two after we came up with the first episode of Monkey Watch. And I meant to talk about it, but I didn't get around to it. I meant to talk about the last Planet of the Apes movie that came out, didn't get around to that. So it was just something off the wall that I came up with. Later in the episode, we're actually going to bring back Monkey Watch for you, because there's been certain people who have asked us to bring back Monkey Watch, and then there's a special little secret as to what you can expect from Monkey Watch in the future, so stay tuned for that. As we barreled towards the end of our retrospective, there was one thing that as I was going back listening to the old episodes, there was one thing that it was really amusing. I don't tend to have extremely quick wit when it comes to certain things, but there was a certain situation in the last just last year that popped up that to this day, when I think about it, I think to myself, I took down Ed pretty well with some really quick wit, and it was pretty funny. So let's take a listen. Hello everyone, welcome to the Batman Universe Comic Podcast, episode number 221, and I am your host, Dustin, and today I have with me...
This is ED.
Not to be confused with erectile dysfunction.
Did you see what just happened? We're not even a minute in, and he took you out.
Woo! It must be Monday.
It is Monday. Even Dustin goes cray cray.
Finally, the last couple of notes that I have about the history of the Batman Universe Comic Podcast is, recently we've had Steph join us, and she's currently helping us cover a bunch of the stuff on the podcast. Stella is currently taking a hiatus. Ultimately, what it comes down to is, over the years, we've had a number of hosts or guest hosts, people who have come on to real quick, because nobody wants to hear just me talk. I know I've been talking for over an hour at this point, and hopefully I'm telling you some information you didn't already know, and it's interesting. But most of the time, especially in the very beginning, having a podcast that just has one person talking can get very boring very quickly. And I know that full well. I knew that my early episodes of the Batman Universe podcast, where I was by myself, were very boring. So the last thing I ever wanted was to have an episode where it was just me talking. Very shortly here, we're going to get into some segments where I bring in some other people. But I wanted to real quick just thank some of the people who have been part of the Batman Universe Comic Podcast. Melinda She was actually part of the Batman Universe podcast. She guested on an episode very briefly, just one episode. But Melinda was on the Batman Universe podcast for a very, very long time. She was a very important member of the Batman Universe podcast. So thank you, Melinda, for your time at TBU. Nick was only on one episode, but obviously, like I said, Nick was part of Bat Books for Beginners for a long, long, long time. And he was really the driving force of making that be what it is. Other people have come and been part of Bat Books for Beginners, and including up to now with Jerry and Chris. But if it wasn't for Nick doing it for as long as he did it, it would not have actually lasted to this point. Savannah, Humphrey, they were both people that joined for a very short episode. Savannah was on the normal podcast. Humphrey was just on for a short time. Ian Miller does a lot of reviews over on the website. He's actually joined us on 2 separate episodes. And then, as I said earlier, Rob, Terrence, and Olivia did Robin War. Terrence and Olivia were on 2 episodes because of that. Rob was actually on 4 episodes because in the very beginning he was with Ed and myself on the Point 5 cast. Chris Mayland, who was one of the original hosts, he was only on for about 3 episodes because his focus was more on the other aspect of stuff, not the comics. But he was around. He was a very instrumental part to TBU as well, because in the very beginning, he was the one who initially said we need to start editing some of these podcasts to make them better. Cut out some of the ums, the uhs, the ohs, all that stuff that I still do to this day. He was very instrumental in deciding that stuff needed to be taken out and we needed to better our quality of what we were producing. He edited the podcast for well over a year, and he was very instrumental, even though he was only on the episodes for a very short time. Like I said, Steph, she's only been on the episodes for she's only been on the Comic Cast for a very short time, but we're appreciating everything that she's doing, filling in for Stella for the time being, and much appreciative is to, just that new aspect of learning a little bit, having somebody who's learning a little bit more about the Batman universe and not just, in the depths of all of the history that like somebody like Ed and myself have been around. Joshua Paul, who was around for 4 episodes during Convergence. John Wilson, who was around for 5 episodes at the beginning of the New 52. Zach was around for a total of 24 episodes, and even though he was only around for what seems like 24 is not that big of a number, but that is a big number when you put it into larger perspective. He also was editing our podcast for a very, very long time, and without certain people like Chris and Zach and Joe and other people that I'm forgetting at this point who have helped us over the years editing the podcast. Podcast editing is not a enjoyable task most of the time. I mean, talking and making a podcast is actually very enjoyable to talk with other people about things that you enjoy and things like that. But actually editing a podcast is extremely time consuming and frustrating at times because there's certain things that you just can't do. And a lot of us have done it over the years, including myself, and have not had a ton of background skills in this and just kind of taught ourselves and learned as we went and then got better as we went. But it's one of those things where if it wasn't for certain people who were around, the podcast probably wouldn't have been able to keep going if it wasn't for certain people like Zach and Chris and Joe who have edited the podcast over the years and helped out. So much appreciated to them. Apple, he was around for 33 episodes from the very beginning, and then from the very first episode, and then he was on for a total of 33 episodes. Apple, like I said, was the instrumental part of creating a comic podcast. He believed that the comics should have their own focus and that we should give more time to focus on the comics, and that's why we spun the Comic Cast out of the Batman Universe podcast, and it was really his ideas to this happening. Josh and Don have been around for, Josh has been around for 48 different episodes. Don has been around for 67 different episodes. Both of them have basically been the cornerstones of part of the building that is TBU. They have been around for a very long time. They've helped out with so many different projects and so many different things, including San Diego. But being part of the comic podcast, for as many episodes as they both were is very appreciated as well. But basically, it's a lot of the other stuff that even when they left the Comic Cast, they still were involved in a variety of other things that were happening on the site and with San Diego and things like that. Joe, as I've said, he edited our podcast, was around for a total of 58 episodes. He, again, still is involved in certain aspects of some of the graphics that we create on the site and things like that, and he has been involved in a massive amount of stuff, editing podcasts on top of recording the podcasts in the middle of the night and giving up time when he was normally would be sleeping. I mean, there has been very few people that we've ever had on the podcast that will not sleep because they would rather record the podcast with us. So that is never going to be forgotten. Ed has been around for 106 episodes, and Ed has been my buddy for a long time. I'm joining for like over 5 years ago, and basically sometimes agreeing with me and sometimes disagreeing with me. All of our conversations, I think, have been great, and I've really appreciated them. He's a guy where if he told me he had to leave tomorrow, I would completely understand, but I would be really, really taken aback by the idea that I would have to do the comic podcast without Ed, because Ed has really been the person who I've really enjoyed doing the podcast with more than the most. And that's not to take anything away from anybody else, but Ed has really been the guy who, when he came on board and his method of talking about things and things like that, I've really enjoyed him. Finally, Stella. Stella has been around for a total of 147 episodes, longer than anybody else other than myself. And Stella, like I said, if it wasn't for Backroll to Oracle and that episode and that show being as successful as it was, I'm not sure TBU would continue to reach new people. I am not a marketing guru. I am not a networking guru. Or very good at it either. I don't have to be a guru, but I'm just not very good at it. But if it wasn't for Stella, I'm not sure that the audience would continue to build, because she does an amazing job of bringing in special guests, bringing other podcast hosts from other popular shows out there on the net, and networking more than pretty much anybody. She's been my right hand when it comes to San Diego for years, about taking care of different things with the PR contacts that I have, since I'm sitting at TBU headquarters putting out the news as it happens. She was always the person who was there to do a good chunk of the news, or chunk of the comic interviews and things like that over the years. So Stella, her time has been much appreciated as well. Thank you to everybody who has been a part of the Batman Universe Comic Podcast over the years. And, just on top of the Batman Universe Comic Podcast, there's been a ton of people who've been involved in a wide variety of different other aspects. My staff, who has been on other podcasts with me, but most importantly, over the years, the one thing that I've really appreciated is all the people who have come and helped out with the website. I never really thought when I started the podcast in January of 2008 that I would have ever created a website as big as it is now, and with as much content as what we do. If there wasn't certain people who are currently helping out right now and currently working on the site, I wouldn't be able to do what I do. We report tons of news, and we do tons of comic reviews every single week, and without the people who are behind the scenes doing that stuff, who you may have never even heard about other than just their name when we're talking about ratings during Greater Gotham, if you didn't hear their names, you might not have ever even heard about them, because they do a lot of the behind the scenes stuff on the site and provide the content that we talk about here on the podcast, as well as talking about, as well as content that you guys can enjoy on a daily and sometimes weekly basis. So I just want to throw out special thanks to certain people who are currently on my staff right now. I want to thank Jessica for putting together Last Week in the Batcave for well over a year now and doing that. She's also been doing TBU by the number. She brought that back. She also reviews comics. But Last Week in the Batcave is, again, one of those ways that we have been able to reach out to other people with the Gothamite section and the area where we focus on different artists. It brings our notice to TBU to other avenues that we wouldn't have otherwise gotten or been part of. It gets the TBU name out there and gets other artists to know who we are, but then also it gets their fans to know who we are too when they talk about the fact that they were featured at TBU. So much appreciative to her. Dan, who currently does all of our news, all of our main news, he puts together all of the news that we have when it relates to movies, TV, video games, the comics. He writes all of that news up and then gets that stuff out extremely quick. Much thanks goes to Dan. Clinton, who's currently doing a lot of our merch news. He puts together a ton of the merch news, and honestly, merch is one of the areas where it probably has more news than any other section, and he puts together a lot of the news for merch. But just to run through the comic reviewers, because honestly, this is like the backbone of what we are as TBU. If it wasn't for our comic book reviewers, we wouldn't be able to have the amount of content that we really have. And over the years, we've had a number of people who have come and helped with comic reviews, but over the past 2 or 3 years, we've had the best group of people helping out and creating an enormous amount of content and reviewing comics. And honestly, if you've never written a comic review, it's not super easy. I don't personally like writing comic reviews. I don't personally like having to put my thoughts down in Word. It's not something that I really super enjoy. So it's very great. I'm very grateful for all the people over the years who have come and helped TBU with reviews and have done that. Currently, we have Adele, Bill, Bob, Corbin, David, Jerry, Ian, Jessica, Oliver, Paul, and Tony, who have been putting together comic reviews on a normal basis for a long time, and that is extremely important to the success of the site, and I thank them very much. I also have to mention just a couple of other people who don't necessarily review comics, but have been instrumental into building TBU over the past couple of years. Corbin has actually been involved with TBU for an extremely long time. Corbin originally came to us as a comic reviewer almost 5 years ago in October of 2013 and has reviewed a ton of stuff. And at one point, Corbin was reviewing, out of maybe 12 books that we were covering on a monthly basis, Corbin was reviewing like 9 of them. He was covering a ton of books. And Corbin is another guy who has been around for a very long time, came on board around the same time as Ed. And it's kind of interesting to see how people's lives have changed as things have happened. Corbin originally came on board. Over the years, he's gotten married. He's had a daughter, and it's just interesting. I mean, obviously, my own life has changed as well. My life has changed I went from being in the military to getting out of the military, having a son, having a daughter, having another son, moving to a different state. I mean, a lot of stuff has happened in 10 years, but it's really cool to see some of the staff members and see how their lives have changed over the years as well. So that's really cool to see. Another person that I want to just throw a real quick mention to is Colin. He also puts together some amazing articles on the site, some character spotlights and things like that. Colin actually heads up a Batman site that I came across a couple years back that I thought was the coolest thing in the world, the Batman Chronology Project, and it basically takes all these Batman stories and puts them in the form, puts them in an exact reading order or an order that makes the most sense. And his project was so awesome, and I reached out to him and said, would you be interested in putting stuff together for TBU? And he came over, and he churns out on average at least one character spotlight a month. Sometimes they're broken up into multiple parts, but there's at least one per month that normally comes out. And he's done some amazing work, and his project alone that he's done is a massive amount of work, and I want to just say go check it out if you haven't. So with that, that's basically everything. I mean, just real quick, I've been on 242 episodes of the comic podcast, between Convergence and some of those specials that I wasn't part of. I've almost been on all of the episodes, and honestly, there's only been a couple episodes that I haven't been on that I chose I didn't want to be on. There was, outside of the 4 for Convergence and the 2 that were for Robin War, there was 2 other episodes that I just wasn't part of, and it's just one of those things where, like, I have always told myself that I need to be here in order to make sure that this podcast happens, and that might not always be the case. I can't promise that in 250 episodes that it'll still be me as the main host of the Batman Universe Comic Podcast. As you know, I used to be the main host of the Batman Universe Podcast, and I stepped back and had other people run that because I wanted to dedicate more time to talking about the comics because that's something that I really enjoy. So can I say that I'll always be here being your voice for the Batman Universe on the comic podcast? No, but I've enjoyed my time. There's been plenty of downs when it comes to the content that DC has put out, but there's been plenty of ups, and a lot of it is even between the ups and downs of what DC is currently or previously has released. Part of the thing that has always been enjoyable is just the ability to sit down with other members who are Bat fans just like myself, sit down and talk about the books, whether we like them or not, completely rant about them, destroy the book because it's so bad, or, rave about it because we loved it so much. It's one of those things where I am extremely appreciative to everybody who's ever been on the podcast with me to talk about comics. So real quick, before we move into our next segment, I want to just play a couple of real cool well wishes that were sent over for the Comic Cast.
Hello, Dustin, Ed, Steph, and all listeners of the Batman universe, past, present, and future. Congratulations on 250 episodes of the Comic Cast. Many podcasts have gone to the hundreds and some even to the thousands, but this is a particular milestone because the Batman universe is, without speaking bias, because I've been on it for so many years, truly a bastion of real, solid, worthwhile content in the Batman fan community. I know there are other sites out there that, try to get the hottest deets on what Scott Snyder is doing or what Warner Brothers is doing, but I feel that the Batman universe, like the heart and the mind of real interest, has always kind of been aligned for me. I'm remembering back on just kind of when I first listened to the Comic Cast, I was listening when Josh was on way back when you guys would do like character spotlights. Like 10 years ago. I believe I started listening Final Crisis era. I remember listening back when Dan DiDio was writing the Outsiders comic book. And since then we've weathered such fun storms as, like the New 52 and Batman Reborn, the Michael Lane Azrael series, the Yo Simone Batgirl series, and all other runs, all the other famous moments, Batman Inc., Gordon being Batman. Of course, I wasn't on that one, but I really appreciate what this podcast, what this website has done. I really appreciate, Dustin, you having me on the website and contributing generating whatever thoughts I have on the site. I really appreciate the opportunity that you give us to go out and do reporting. Some of my most cherished moments of my life are honestly interviewing Devin Grayson and Chuck Dixon, and I would not be able to have done that without you. I would not have been able to meet people without you. I would not be able to have made the connections and further my own potential in writing without the Batman universe. And honestly, I miss being on the Comic Cast. I know that's a different era, and that was several years ago, but I really enjoyed it, and I certainly didn't leave the podcast because of what the podcast was doing. It's just different eras in comics, but congratulations to you, Dustin. Congratulations, Ed, newcomer Steph. Hope you buckle your seatbelt and hang on. It's going to be a wild ride. Congratulations to Joe and Nick and Stella and Apple and everyone who has come beforehand and kind of helped build upon the many episodes of the Comic Cast along the way. And here's to 2,050 more.
Hi, this is Ben, TBU's intern and convention correspondent. Congrats on the 250th episode of Comic Cast!
Hey, this is Ryan.
Hey, this is Terrence.
And this is Rob from Rob and Everyone Loves the Drake. The three of us want to wish TBU and the Comic Cast a happy 250 episodes, and I think we're at what?
Yay!
We're at what, 74? So I just want to thank TBU for adding us to the podcast, and I actually had a small little window that I was part of the Comic Cast for a little while, and then I found Terrence over at the Bat Fans podcast, and the rest is Drake history. So you guys have been paving the way for Rob and Everyone Loves the Drake, and happy 250 episodes, guys.
Hi, this is Paul Shanley. I review comics and a lot of the DC animated new releases for the website. A big congratulations to Dustin, Stella, and Ed, and everyone else for 250 episodes of the podcast. It's surprising with all the Batman content floating around in podcast land that there's actually not that much that focuses solely on the comics, and the TBU gang does a great job of covering the source material. Here's to 250 more episodes, which, if my math is right, would take us to Monkey Watch 2028. Cheers, guys.
All right, so our next segment on our special 250th episode is we're going to be actually, we have Ed, Steph, and Josh Bertoni, who has kindly joined us. But the four of us are going to actually talk about some of our favorite moments from the last 10 years and 250 episodes of the Batman Universe Comic Podcast. We've covered a lot of stuff over the last 10 years. We had New 52, we had Rebirth. There was all kinds of stuff in between those things, like special months and things like that. So let's start with the past. Josh, what was one of your favorite moments from the Comic Cast?
It's I don't want to sound like a negative person when I say this, but I have a lot of fun when we take down a book that's just really, really, really horrible. And, you know, I don't want to make it sound like we're overly negative because, you know, we love Batman. We love these comics. And, you know, and we find a lot of joy in them. But when you're podcasting, sometimes it's just fun to rip something apart. And one of my favorite ones, it was either issue 2 or 3 of Batman Incorporated, but it was an issue where, like, Grant Morrison had retconned that, like, Kathy Kane was, like, the most important woman in the DC universe, and, like, she was, like, you know, a Nazi princess, and, like, Batman was actually in love with her the whole time, unlike the Silver Age where, like, he actually couldn't stand her. And I remember we just talked about this was like a comic cast where I was recording it from work as usual, and I was like not feeling well. It was the end of the night. I was kind of tired, and like when it got to Batman Incorporated issue, I want to say 3, I just like woke up and we basically took that book out in an alley and like shot it between the eyes. That was a lot of fun. Do you remember that one, Dustin?
I do remember that. I think there were some other episodes that were very, very similar in fashion where we did some stuff where we just hated. I think one of another issue that we did that for that I know you were around for was when we did Teen Titans number 0 during New 52. And they basically redid the entire origin of Tim Drake and how he became Robin, how he basically blackmailed Batman into becoming Robin. Yeah, or Red Robin, yeah.
He was never Robin.
Yeah, never Robin, just Red Robin. And in order to become Red Robin, he just blackmailed Batman into becoming it. And that was an episode that we spent an enormous amount of time talking about how it was ridiculous that they were redoing all of the origins for so many of these so many characters just for the sake of saying let's do something different.
It may be one of the worst issues of like the past 10 years too. I mean,
yeah, I would agree.
That's a brutally, not just as it poorly constructed. We've had a lot of poorly constructed issues, but it's like a fundamental slap in the face for long-term fans. Like it is just brutal.
I remember one of the highlights of that episode was Stella and I were like really arguing over the merits of the issue, and like she was like, you know, really like driving her feet into the ground, like trying to tell me that this made sense. And I still bring this up to this day, but like, and this bears repeating. They put Tim Drake in the Witness Protection Program, but here's how the Witness Protection Program decided to protect Tim Drake. They changed his last name, but not his first name. They didn't dye his hair, change his appearance in any way. they kept him in the same city and put him with the most photographed man in the world. That is like, if you work for the witness protection program, you lose your job. You're fired.
Yeah.
It's bad. The whole thing's bad.
Yeah,
it's just bad. I mean, that's one of the few issues that there is almost no redeeming qualities to. You know what I mean? It's just bad. Like, no.
Another one that I remember we had fun taking down was there was a right before the New 52, there was a storyline in Birds of Prey, Death of Oracle, and the last part was Oracle fakes her death, but the logistics of it made no sense. It was wait, so if all the heroes think that she's dead, then aren't they wondering why Barbara Gordon's still alive? And then only certain heroes were told she was alive, and then we were why is she telling Misfit she's alive but not Cassandra Cain? And there's a montage at the end of Booster Gold has to disarm a nuclear bomb or something, and all these heroes are dying, and they're calling for Oracle's help, and she's ignoring them. She's I must continue to have my death faked, otherwise Calculator will be mad at me or something. And I was he's trying to disarm a nuclear bomb. You can give him help. Booster Gold's not going to tell any. Well, maybe Booster Gold will. It might not have been Booster Gold. It was Blue Beetle or something, maybe. But the point stands that was another stupid storyline that I remember we spent a lot of time just taking out back and beating with the baseball bats.
Yep, that has happened a lot over the years. But one of the things, especially with beating books to death, do you remember the large? I know Ed would remember this, and I know Josh, you were around for the tail end or the beginning of this. But there was a huge group of episodes. I want to say it was a chunk of maybe 50 episodes, just past probably episode 95, all the way through episode maybe 130, or about 130, and where basically every episode we would just hate on the books, and listeners started to tell us that we were ridiculously negative, and it started to affect me because I was I can't help the fact that these books suck. I can only praise a book that's good. Don't I understand that you're going to get upset because for so many episodes we were extremely, extremely negative on stuff, but there was a lot of stuff that was really, really bad during that time frame.
I remember Don on an episode, I don't even think I was on the episode, losing his mind over how bad the Gail Simone Batgirl run was. Remember that?
Yeah.
I remember it was so like Josh says, sometimes negativity can be funny, and it was so funny. I remember listening in my car, and I had done stuff with Don at that point, and I actually had to pull over my car because he was just why are we even reading this? It's terrible. What are we talking? It was because it was that Batgirl run was so divisive, And again, that's when you guys were covering all the books. And yeah, I remember that. And although you don't want to be negative 24/7, when something's as bad as some of that stuff was, it's tough not to be negative. We're actually kind of blessed now, those of us that are on Comcast, because since New 52, although New 52 was a travesty in a lot of ways, the monthly books that came out, which being Batman and Detective, were pretty good. You had...
Yeah, Detective later on.
Detective once they replaced the original... people that were on it, but once they got to when Tomasi's, we had a while where we had a Snyder run going on that was good, and we had Tomasi's run on Batman and Robin for a while that was good, and then we got was it Buccellato and Manapul on Detective. It was we had a good run there. It was all pretty good.
There's definitely moments of glimmer from the New 52 that were redeeming points, but I think overall. I think especially in the very beginning, I think we as hosts, and I speak for those of us who were there in the very beginning and those of us who were there throughout the entire New 52, in the very beginning of the New 52, I think a lot of us, and that actually, I'll say this was one of my moments. It's kind of a cheat moment because it doesn't actually have to do with the comic. It has to do with the comic cast, but unfortunately, because of the way I was so extremely hard structured when it came to where things go, we actually recorded an episode at the beginning of June of 2011. It was after they announced Rebirth, and there was 5 of us. Don was there, Josh was there, Joe was there, and we talked about
you mean New 52?
Yeah, the New 52.
Announced Rebirth.
Yeah, I meant New 52. When they announced New 52 was in May of 2011. Yeah, and we talked about the New 52 and the announcements that they had made, the creative teams, and the overall idea of what it was. And I think as a whole, I think a lot of us were put off by the idea of let's start everything fresh, let's start everything new. And like, I know at that point Marvel had done stuff like that, but as a DC fan and someone who hadn't really experienced that on the Marvel side of stuff, because I don't read Marvel and I don't really pay attention to the stuff that's going on over there most of the time, I wasn't really prepared for something as drastic as what the New 52 was. And yes, there were moments of decent stories. Scott Snyder's run overall was probably one of the biggest highlights from the New 52. I mean, I had issues with certain things that he did and things like that, but the writing overall was very well done, and the stories were comprehensive, and it wasn't like it was rewriting the entire history of things. He definitely took liberties and rewrote certain aspects of Batman's history, but there was a lot of things where he was still trying to just tweak little bits that could be tweaked without messing with past stuff. But overall, there was so much stuff that was happening in the beginning where it just felt like they were ignoring so much stuff. I mean, I remember reviewing Batgirl and saying, how could we possibly be almost a year into Batgirl and we have not found out how in the world she's walking again? And I remember interviewing Gail Simone at C2E2 the year after 52 started, and I asked her, it's like, when are we going to hear the story about how Batgirl got to walk again? And she just stone-faced looked at me and said, we already had that. I mentioned that it was, I mentioned it in a panel that talked about how she had surgery. I was like,
a miracle cure.
And I looked back at her and I was like, wait, are you serious?
We're good here, right? Yes.
We went from a character was in a wheelchair, she was paralyzed for almost 20 years in the comics, and you had a panel saying I had surgery, and that's supposed to be the story? I mean, really? And the worst part about it was there were solicitations that led us to believe that we were going to learn about her past and how things had changed, and all it ended up being was PTSD issues related to the Killing Joke, but not actually talking about how she got back into being Batgirl, being out of the wheelchair, giving up the role of Oracle. None of that. It was just like they completely ignored it. There were so many things that happened. I mean, Red Robin / Tim Drake was ignored for a massive amount of the New 52. It was like he got thrown into Teen Titans, and that's where he was, and everyone just ignored who he was. And anytime he was involved with anything related to Batman, it was not the Tim Drake character that we all knew from prior, pre-Flashpoint. And the New 52 as a whole was, I think, like I was saying, so my favorite moment was actually the special that we did when we were talking about, what to do and what was coming, and we talked about the announcements and our expectations of what was happening. And I think overall we were all very, very cautious about what was coming, and I know some of us were not happy at all. I mean, that's actually why Josh ended up permanently leaving the Comic Cast, was because of what happened with New 52. But it was a very hard time, because I've always appreciated the massive history of the characters, especially in modern continuity, and just somehow ignoring so much of the more modern continuity just for the sake of telling some new stories. It was just mind-boggling to me. But I think it had to do with a lot that I just wasn't prepared. And then, to flash forward to the future, the other moment that I was really grateful or really enjoyed was when Ed and I did the live episode that we did where we reacted to the stuff they were announcing for Rebirth.
The Rebirth stream.
Yeah,
that was cool.
They were doing the Rebirth stream, and they were announcing what they were doing, and they were acknowledging that they messed up with the New 52. And Ed and I were watching the stream and talking about it as it was happening. And I just kept thinking, it was probably one of the moments in comic history as far as the Comic Cast and being involved in the comics community and reading comics, that I legitimately was hearing what they were saying and extremely excited for what was coming, because I kept thinking, finally, we're going to get back to some of the versions of the characters that I knew from when I started the Comic Cast and really got into reading a lot of comics and things like that. And that live stream was probably it was great because the publishers were acknowledging that they made mistakes, and that was probably the one thing where I was like, I'm glad they know they did something wrong, and they're going to come up with ideas of how to fix some of this or change other things or whatever. But the idea is that they're acknowledging that New 52 was a mistake, and that was a big deal in my mind. So,
and we got a huge info dump all at one time. Like,
yes.
It wasn't like the typical, like, stay tuned in 2 weeks for more information. Like, it was everything, all the books, all at once. Who were the creators? What were we doing? You know?
Yeah, and there was stuff, and they didn't. It wasn't even as if they had to. I mean, they announced stuff that didn't actually even launch until
for quite a while. Like that Mystic U book came out like a year later.
Yeah, Mystic U that came out a while back. Super Sons, Batwoman,
like 6 months afterwards or something.
Yeah, Justice League of America. A lot of those books didn't even launch until almost a year after that announcement. It was just because they were planning so far ahead, and some of the planning has worked out well. Some of the planning that they've done it's kind of bit them in the butt with some of the double ship books having issues with the artists and things like that. But for the most part, Rebirth has been a breath of fresh air and kind of rejuvenated, a lot of the stories and characters, and even the comic cast in general, because I think we've appreciated and enjoyed some of the stuff that they've been doing compared to the horrific 5 years of the New 52.
One thing that's worth noting too, I mean, we're talking about if you want to go back to the beginning of the comic cast, some of the first things that we covered were it was like, I remember when I came on, we were at the tail end of Batman R.I.P.
Yep.
And we did like Battle for the Cowl and Batman Reborn, which was like the Dick Grayson as Batman era, and then like the Bruce Wade Road Home, which was like a massive episode because there was like so many specials, like Bruce Wayne, Road Home, Oracle, and then like we went from Outsiders being like one of the best books ever to being one of the worst books ever, like overnight. Because like, remember that run where Alfred was leading the team and he even had like a battle with Deathstroke for like 3 panels that like he like held his own on and survived. And then like Dan DiDio took over the book and it was about like Geoforce and Markovia, and then it sucked.
That sounds about right.
Whenever it starts geopolitics rather than superhero concerns and villains, it's always when you run into an issue. But I want to give Steph a moment, because Steph is fairly new to the comic cast, but she's been going back and listening to a lot of the older episodes. Steph, what's one of your favorite moments that you as a listener were heard?
The one thing that got me started listening was about a year ago, I think, and you guys had a listener comment on who is Batman to you. And so it was actually a very interesting introduction to Ed, Stella, and Dustin of why they're doing this and like who Batman is to them and what they look for in their Batman comics. So that was very insightful and very, very cool for me to hear, to kind of get an idea of where you guys are standing as you're reviewing these comics. So I enjoyed that almost everyone loved Bruce as the Bat Dad and his little Bat family. So I thought that was pretty cool.
That's a good one.
I also was traumatized a few episodes ago because Don and Stella got engaged, and Don and Stella weren't engaged, and my poor little heart couldn't take all the little emotion swings.
They still get grief for that to this day.
I forgot about that.
Yeah, so back in 2013, we announced on the Comic Cast
That's right.
that Don and Stella were getting married, and then on April 1st, their wedding ceremony took place, where everyone from the Comic Cast, at that time, past and present, had made an appearance in the wedding.
They had some close personal friends who were very, very upset with them for that one.
Props to them, though, because they pulled that off on so many levels. I mean,
I believed every minute of it.
It wasn't just on the Comic Cast and the actual special that we posted. It was actually, they were living the lie on Facebook for like 2 months prior to the wedding.
Yeah, it was a very well thought out and long reaching practical joke.
People like for years afterwards were going to Don saying, "Oh yeah, I heard you got married," and then he was like, "No." And then Donovan and I were still on Spider-Man Crawl Space at that point, and there's like a message board like feedback section of the show, and like the episode afterwards was a bunch of people like saying congratulations on your engagement, Dawn. And then like Dawn had to say like 10 times in that episode, Stella and I didn't get married. Stella and I didn't get married. Stella and I didn't get married.
As for like a comic, I loved. Oh, was it John from England?
John Roque was on Bat Books for Beginners, but I think you mean Joe.
Joe, yeah, no, Joe.
Was a Comic Cast host for a long time too.
Joe trying to summarize Batman Odyssey was always so funny because he's like, "I'm so sorry, I'm trying the best I can. I don't actually know what was going on."
Yeah, in fairness, nobody else in the world knew what was going on either. So
I think Batman Odyssey was one of those reasons that we stopped covering some of the miniseries. Not that every miniseries ends up being as bad as Batman Odyssey by any means, but there's sometimes some miniseries are best to cover when they are complete, rather than issue by issue. But yeah, Batman Odyssey, I don't regret that book, or I don't regret. I regret covering that book. I don't regret forgetting about the book until Ed brings it up every time he brings it up.
What? It's a modern masterpiece, right? Am I doing it wrong? Am I doing this wrong?
That's wrong.
The funny thing is, what I'm hearing from you is this book was so bad that it changed the way that we cover miniseries on the podcast.
Yes, that's exactly right.
That's what I'm hearing too.
And the sad part is the New 52, as with all of the supporting characters like Nightwing, Batgirl, Birds of Prey, Red Hood and the Outlaws, and Catwoman. Oh man, I got a funny comment about Catwoman. So Ed and I, Ed came on board and started with me, and actually at the time, Rob, who does Robin Everyone Loves a Drake, he was on the first 2.5 episodes too, and then he hit he left and didn't look back at all.
One could argue he's smarter than us.
Yes, that's true. But so we started doing all of these these books that we weren't covered on as part of the normal releases, and there was a point where we had done this. We were doing this once a month at that time. The podcast, the Comic Cast was releasing twice a month. The 0.5 cast was releasing once a month to cover everything else that wasn't covered on the other 2 episodes for the month. So over the course of just 5 months, we got to a point where Catwoman was so bad that I actually had to forego my normal intro. And we actually, because as I've been going back and going over the old episodes, I've been listening to like the first couple minutes of every episode to make sure that I know who's on every episode, so I can get a running tally of how many episodes everybody's been on, and then also see if there's any announcements, important things that happen in each episode and things like that. Which you're hearing me say this, but you just heard me talk all about this in the retrospective that happened before this, in that segment. But when I got to 123.5, the first 5 seconds of the episode is Ed saying, "So we're starting with Catwoman, huh?" And I said, "Yep." And he goes, "So we're just going to get it out of the way, right?" And I was like, "Yeah, I don't know that I could go the whole episode with that looming that's coming. So let's just get it out of the way."
And that clip should be played here.
Hello.
Hello.
All right, there we go. So we're doing Catwoman first this time, huh?
Yeah, because I want to get it out of the way.
It's probably not a bad call.
Put it at the end. I'll dread the end of this podcast.
Those books were insanely bad, man. Like, there wasn't any of them that we were reviewing at the time that were any good.
And let me tell you something here, Steph. In my, you whippersnapper don't know how easy you have it only covering Batman and Detective on the Comic Cast. In my day, we had Comic Cast where we cover like 12 books in one episode. Like,
it's true.
Like, does somebody like, okay, we're doing a Flashpoint, like some series where like Batman's mom is the Joker, and then like this random miniseries, and then like, well, like, I pretty much left because of the New 52, but like the secondary reason was just I was like burned out by doing like 30 books like per episode sometimes, but like it was mainly the New 52 though.
Yeah, just to put in perspective, when we first started the Comic Cast back in 2008, the very first episode we had, which was actually fairly short, we only had actually 2 issues, and then we had 3 issues, and we covered a graphic novel. But what was interesting about that was like a real big one-off, because as soon as you get into like episode, let's say, so in episode 30, which was in just about a year, a little after a year later, we were covering 8 issues per episode, and that was on the lower end. I think I averaged out. There was episodes where we had anywhere from 8 to 12 issues per episode because there was so much stuff. There was also a problem because in the very beginning we were only doing once a month instead of twice a month, and that was actually part of the reason we started doing it twice a month, was because there was just too much to cover in one episode.
100,000 books.
Now, if we covered everything, like if we covered everything on the Comic Cast that we cover on the website on a weekly basis, we would have to be doing it weekly just to keep up and not have ridiculously long episodes. But I also, in the defense of the old episodes, there were episodes where, so for example, I'm looking at episode 30, we covered Batman and Robin number 5, but the amount of time we covered it was a total of 4 minutes. So there wasn't some episodes, some issues we spent more time on. I'm looking at the average here looks to be between somewhere like about 7 minutes per issue. So, I mean, like, even though we covered 8 issues in that episode, we actually the episode was only about an hour and 42 minutes, which is about as long as we have now with our normal episodes. So it was just by reducing the amount of issues per episode, we actually increased the ability to have longer discussions and talk about the issues a little bit more in depth. And that's what it is now, because now I think on average we talk about each issue somewhere in the neighborhood of about 20 minutes in some cases. So, and sometimes longer, depending on if there's something sort of controversial or something like that. So it's definitely changed over the years. I mean, going from just a bunch of issues for only a short amount of time to just a couple of issues for a much longer period of time. I think overall fans have enjoyed our longer discussions per episode, but I'm sure that fans would love if we covered every issue that releases every week. But unfortunately,
that's what the spin-off casts are for.
Yeah, we just don't have the willpower to do that. So
yeah, you want to hear about the Birds of Prey and Batgirl? Listen to Batgirl the Oracle.
Exactly.
I got a job.
Yeah.
You want to hear about whatever Tim Drake's doing? We got Everyone Loves the Drake. There's a TBU podcast for everything that you're into. In those old days too, like every single like event had like a million tie-ins. So like Battle for the Cow, oh cool, that's a miniseries, that's an event. But then like Battle for the Cow, which was a spin-off of the Grant Morrison run, had its own spin-offs because like in addition to Battle of the Cow,
spin-offs had spin-offs.
Yeah, it had 5
it was like
one-shots and 2 or 3 other miniseries attached to it too.
Yeah, like Battle for the Cow, the network. Battle for the Cow,
Commissioner Gordon,
Alfred's Crazy.
Gotham Gazette, the Gotham Gazette.
I liked the Gotham Gazettes. Those were good. I remember I gave like those like very, very, very high marks on the Comic Cast. Those were like some of my favorite issues to review. But like I hated the network and like the other stupid spin-offs.
Thank God we're in a new era. The real sorrow of the Comic Cast is that the best episode we've ever recorded, no one got to hear. Oh yeah, we recorded an episode about a year ago. It was easily the best episode of Comic Cast ever recorded, and Dustin forgot to press the recording button.
That's a podcaster's rite of passage.
Yeah.
Well, that's happened a couple different times, and the problem is that over the years, so years and years ago when we first started recording podcasts, we did them on Skype, and then over the years, however it has worked out, Skype is just not being very reliable for us. We've always had random issues here and there, and I know that there's people who still use Skype, but it's just we've had issues, so we stopped using it, and then we start using something else, and we're using that for a while, and then that becomes unreliable, or something changes and it becomes harder to use or whatever, and we've had to change and adapt over the years because of technology changing or software becoming outdated or whatever. And yeah, there's been plenty of times where I have forgotten to record, and it wasn't just that one time, but yes, there was an episode that Ed is referring to, and I can't remember what it was, but we spent a good 2 hours recording, or I thought recording, and it was an in-depth conversation about all kinds of news and all kinds of comics, and we did awesome reviews, and it was a really great episode.
Fantastic.
I don't know if it was by far our best episode.
No one can hear it, so absolutely it was our best.
It was going to win an Emmy for best podcast recording.
Yeah, it was absolutely the best. It's not even close. Yeah.
But I mean, it was a very good episode, and we had some really great conversations. And then all of a sudden, we got done recording. We hang up the call. We're all done, and I sent an email saying I went to go look at the file, and I looked, and I was like, "There's nothing here." Oh crap! And I sent them a message, and I was like, "So, I hate to say this, but we didn't get any of what we recorded, so we got to figure out a time to do this." And we ended up doing it, and the episode, which was originally like 2 hours and 15 minutes or something, we re-recorded it, and we breezed through it, and it was less than like an hour and 15 minutes.
Yeah, it was like an hour and 5 minutes.
Because we were just rehashing everything that we already talked about and just breezing through it. So, yeah, if you are new to podcasting, you're listening to this thinking, oh, this is a 10th anniversary, let's hear some insight. Always remember to hit the record button. Always.
And have backups, because sometimes even hitting the record button doesn't work. Like, Donovan, I know, like, he has 2 recorders running at once. Like, I kid you not. Because, like, everybody has learned their lesson. Everyone has, like, it's horrible sometimes. One favorite moment before we move on that we missed was, just going back to what you guys said about the Gail Simone run of Batgirl. It was the issue that where she and James Jr. are like fighting on a pier, and like Barbara Sr. is like kidnapped, and like James Jr. is presumed dead. Like that issue was so universally reviled. Like Donovan was like screaming, "I hate this comic," and Dustin like. I don't have the exact quote, but this would be another good clip to put in there if you have it. Like Dustin says, some comic reviewers are afraid to put their name on a bad review because they don't want to get on DC's bad side. Dustin said, "Well, I'm not afraid. My name is Dustin Fritschel, and this is a bad comic."
And I feel as if there's some sites out there and some reviewers and critics who will not review issues when it's not nearly as good as they need it to be. And I think that's to protect themselves from, trying to say that a creator did a bad job. Well, I'll be right here. I'm from the Batman universe. My name is Dustin Fritschel, and this is a horrible issue. And if you think this is a good issue, good for you. But to me, this was crap. And I cannot comprehend how there's people out there who think that this is good. Over the years, there's been plenty of bad comics, and my thing was always this. I never started the comic podcast with the intent of being a marketing machine for DC. I mean, in all honesty, that is what we are, but it's not meant to be that. It just happens to be that because we're promoting the material that they're releasing. But in the beginning, it was extremely difficult to get anything scheduled with in regards to anything, like just trying to get an interview with anybody. I take that back. Actually, in the very, very beginning, before social media was as big as it was, and before everybody was so linked with everything, and the PR people at DC at the time wasn't anything like it is now, where every convention they have a massive list of people that you can interview, and they have tons of PR representatives. It wasn't like that at all. In the very beginning, when we started the podcast, if I wanted to interview somebody, I'd just simply try to find their email address online, which at that time was pretty easy because almost every artist or writer had their website somewhere, even if it was just like here's my personal blog, and you could send them a comment or an email or whatever asking if you could do an interview. And in the beginning, it was extremely easy. If you go back on the TBU specials, you look at the interviews that we've done over the years, there was tons of interviews that we did just in that first couple of years that TBU was around. And that's because it was extremely easy. Then there was a point, this was before New 52, there was a point where we wanted to interview Mike Martz, who at the time was the Bat Group editor, which is the equivalent to who Jamie S. Rich is right now, and who Mark Doyle was before that. But Mike Martz was it, and we wanted to interview him, and we had to set this up with DC because he's actually a DC full-fledged, full-time employee. And we contacted DC, and try to set this up. And we did it. It was an okay interview. I wouldn't say it was an amazing interview because he obviously couldn't give a whole lot of secrets away. And an editor is probably the last person who's going to give any secrets away. But you can probably almost guarantee that if you're talking to a writer or an artist and they know something they're not supposed to know, they're not always sure whether or not they can talk about stuff, but sometimes they let things slip even to this day about things that they're not supposed to reference or talk about because it hasn't been announced. But
Adam accidentally revealed that Stephanie was Batgirl like 6 months before that happened.
Yeah, and it's happened a bunch of different times, but at that time, talking to an editor probably wasn't the best idea. Well, there was a situation that came up, and I don't like sitting here. I don't like tooting my own horn normally, but I'm going to do it this time just because. But after we got done doing that interview with Mike Martz, I pitched this idea to Mike Martz where we would have him answer a couple of questions because used to have the editors, the letters pages at the end of comics, and they didn't have that anymore. And most of the time it was the editors who were responding to the questions. And I thought, wouldn't this be a great idea? We have listeners give questions, we filter them, and then we send them to DC. They filter out whatever they want to filter out, and then Mike Martz can answer the questions. And then it leads to an ongoing article and also an ongoing relationship with DC Comics. And at the time, we weren't really involved with DC Comics. We didn't get any sort of like review copies of anything. We weren't getting press releases from them. We had to search for all of the news that we were reporting on our own. And I pitched this idea to them, and they were like, "Oh, that's Mike Martz was like, oh yeah, that's a great idea, but you're going to have to pitch that over to the publicity people." And I pitched it to them, and they were like, oh, "Okay, we'll let you know." And then like 5 days later, they got back to me and was like, "You know what? We decided we're not going to do that at this time." And I'm not kidding you. 5 days after they sent that response saying it wasn't going to happen, Comic Book Resources launched a new article series where they were doing a monthly article with Mike Martz talking about taking questions. They weren't from viewers, but they were taking questions related to the books that had already released. It was the exact same thing that I pitched to them. And the fact that it ended up on a much bigger website, it really ticked me off. And for years, I was really upset about that. And it probably did not do a lot of good for the site for me to be really upset about it. But I was upset because I came up with this awesome idea. I pitched it, and it ended up being shot down, but only given away to a bigger news outlet. And yeah, so I was really upset about that. And then the New 52 came, and that just, compounded everything that was going on with them ignoring the people who had been reading and supporting the books for years by changing everything and saying we need to get new readers. And instead of trying to figure out how to bring new readers in, just ignore the old readers and just concentrate on these new readers that you don't even have yet. And it was really frustrating. So, for years, the Comic Cast was something that, listening through a lot of episodes, I can tell you that there was a lot of episodes in the beginning or in that middle time frame that I mentioned earlier where I can hear my voice and know that I was just not excited to do the Comic Cast. And it was because I wasn't enjoying doing the comics. And I'm glad that I didn't stop doing it. And I'm glad that over the years, I've only taken a couple of breaks and not covered certain things. Like I wasn't involved with Convergence, which thank God I wasn't involved in that. Yeah. I wasn't involved in Convergence. Ed headed that up, but there were certain aspects that just over the years have happened that really have not been super great. But I'm glad that at this point I'm in a much better position as far as enjoyment of the books. Sure, I've got issues and sure I've got complaints. That's never going to stop as a critic on comics or a person who talks about comics and reviews them. I'm never going to stop having issues about that kind of stuff. That's what I'm supposed to do. If everything was perfect, I don't know that I'd have a whole lot to talk about. People always get on us about how we don't talk about the art, but the only time we ever really talk about the art is when we have a issue with the art. And most of the time the art's good. There's not a lot to talk about when things are good. But the other problem is that if there's too much bad to talk about, then everyone just hates the fact that you're being so negative on stuff. So, but my point is over the years, there's been a lot of different stuff. And going back to Josh's comment about how, I said that I didn't want, I'm not here to, try to make sure that DC gets good ratings for or good reviews for everything. It just comes down to, even now we have a much better relationship with DC, where we are involved with them with review copies of certain stuff, and we do get press releases, and we've scheduled interviews through them in the last couple of years, and we've worked with them at the conventions and things like that. So we have a much better relationship with them. But over the years, we have had a up and down relationship with what they've been producing, and that in turn could have had something to do with the way we were respected by DC. But ultimately, we're here to tell you whether or not something is good or bad, and it doesn't make a difference whether or not DC gives us a review copy of it, because honestly, if they're going to give us a review copy and they're going to only expect us to give a good review, then they're not really looking for honesty. So we are here to be honest for you, and if that means we have to tell you that something sucked, then it sucked. But that comment that Josh said, I mean, it still stands true today. It just so happens that the stuff is better. So
yeah, thankfully. And just the Batman universe, 10 years later, and I know this is, mainly the Comic-Cast's anniversary, but, comment about the site as a whole. The prestige, I know you said you don't want to toot your own horn, but I mean, I'm going to toot, because 10 years, we deserve it. It's our friggin' birthday. Our prestige and respect among DC and Warner Brothers has grown. We are doing things now that I wish, I couldn't have dreamed of us doing as a fan site, 10 years ago. I mean, it's been great, and creators and talent, they know our name, they recognize us, because when Stella Donovan and I do the convention correspondence stuff, some of the creators are like, oh, Batman Universe, yeah, come, oh yeah, we love you guys. We get responses like that, more often than not. And I sent Dustin. I mean, and this next part has very little to do with the Comic-Cast side of things. But when I was doing the Tribeca TV festival, red carpet thing last fall, they have different spots that the press stands on. They do the red carpet that says their outlet name. And there was one that said the Batman Universe, and I took a picture of it, I think, and I sent it to Dustin. Hey, look, the Batman Universe 10 years later has made it to the red carpet.
Yep. I mean, and the thing is, a lot of it has to do with the commitment level that not just me. I mean, a lot of it, yes, I was around in the very beginning, but there has been so many people who have been a part of not just this podcast, but other podcasts that we have, and the other podcasts have helped us be successful too. I mean, if it was just this podcast, or if it was just the Batman Universe podcast, which has been on hiatus forever, I mean, if it was just those podcasts might not have been able to get us to where we are now. I mean, a lot of the other podcasts, they focus on a very different audience, or a specific audience that isn't necessarily specifically looking for what we are producing. So Back with the Oracle, Robin Everyone Loves a Drake, Taking Flight, Bat Fans, Bruce Wayne's World, even the Gotham Chronicle, as much as I have had a love-hate, mostly hate relationship with that show. I mean, all of these podcasts that we've done over the years, they've all brought in different groups of people to the Batman universe. And if it wasn't for everyone working collectively over the past 10 years, we definitely wouldn't be where we are now. And I mean, the biggest thing is, I'm thankful for everybody who has ever been a guest host on the podcast, a co-host who's edited the podcast for us. All of that stuff. There's just been so many people that have been involved over the last 10 years. If we just talk about this podcast, I mean, we've had well over 20 people either guest host or co-host on the podcast over the years. Even if they come in for just one episode as, a fill-in for somebody who had to go on vacation or something, all of those people have had some sort of impact on what we've done over the last 10 years. And I can only be super grateful and super appreciative, because even now when I put out a call for, new comic book reviewers or new co-hosts or new people who are interested in doing different things like writing comic book reviews on the website and things like that. Still to this day, I still get people who are interested, and there are people who have been around for a long time, and there's people who are around just for a little while, but everybody has some sort of impact on TBU. And all I can say is thank you to everyone who has been involved with TBU as a entity, as a podcast, as a site, as anything that we've produced over the past 10 years. Thank you to everyone. Before we move on, I want to take a moment real quick to play a special message from Stella.
Salvete omnes, it's Stella from Backroll the Oracle. Congrats on reaching 250 episodes. Wow. I wish I could be there to celebrate with you, but I'm actually in Kenya right now on a mission trip. Wow. That actually, it sounds a lot like the MTV Movie Awards when someone says that they couldn't accept it in person because they are currently filming somewhere. I'm not filming anything. I am actually in Nairobi, Kenya right now. So, I want to come on here at least and give my congrats, and I did some research, and I found out that the first episode of the Batman Universe Comic Podcast dropped on Wednesday, June 25th, 2008. So since Dustin likes the history so much, I thought I would look back at what important things actually happened on June 25th throughout history, not just in 2008. So what sorts of important things happened on this day? Well, in 1630, the fork was introduced to American dining by Governor Winthrop. In 1678, Venetian Elena Cornaro Piscopia is awarded a doctorate of philosophy, and she happens to be the first woman to receive a university doctoral degree, or PhD. A typewriter patent was granted on this day to the man who would go on to produce the QWERTY keyboard. And that was in 1868. In 1876, we had the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where U.S. 7th Cavalry under Brevet Major General George Armstrong Custer was wiped out by Sioux and Cheyenne warriors led by Chiefs Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull in what has become famously known as Custer's Last Stand. In 1929, U.S. President Herbert Hoover authorizes the building of Boulder Dam, aka Hoover Dam. In 1947, the first version of Anne Frank's diary was published in the Netherlands. In 1950, North Korea invades South Korea, beginning the Korean War. And in 1978, the rainbow flag representing gay pride is flown for the first time in the San Francisco Gay Freedom Day Parade. Who was born on this day? The famous author of 1984 and Animal Farm, George Orwell, the center and power forward of the New York Knicks, Willis Reed, Ricky Gervais, and George Michael. Who died on this day? George Armstrong Custer, Thomas Eakins, who was an American painter, Johnny Mercer, who was a songwriter and co-founder of Capitol Records, Jacques Cousteau, an oceanographer, explorer, and scientist, the actress Farrah Fawcett, and of course, Michael Jackson, who would die a year later in 2009 from when this comic podcast aired. But closer to home, you might be wondering what was going on in the comic world. And luckily for us, we can look up what issues were actually on stands on this final Wednesday in June 2008. So these are some issues that came out on Wednesday, June 25th in 2008. Archie number 586, Avengers The Initiative number 14, Batman, which has the RIP banner at the top, Batman number 678, Batman Gotham After Midnight number 2, the trade paperback Batman Jekyll and Hyde, Black Panther number 37, Blue Beetle number 28, Daredevil number 108, Final Crisis number 2 came out on this very day, Hulk number 4, and Huntress Year 1 number 4. One of my personal favorites, Immortal Iron Fist number 16, JSA Classified number 39, The Justice Society of America number 17, Legion of Superheroes number 43, Ms. Marvel number 28, New Avengers number 42, Superman number 677, Teen Titans number 60, as well as Teen Titans Year 1 number 6, Trinity number 4, that weekly series that happened after Countdown, Ultimate Spider-Man number 123, and Uncanny X-Men number 499. Tried to give you a sense of some Marvel as well as DC. Dustin knows how I love to do that. So it looks like you're in good company, TBU. There are wonderful books coming out in 2008 on that very day. And also on June 25th, a lot of important things happen, not only for our nation, but also for the world. So hey, let's raise a non-alcoholic glass to the Comicast's 250th episode. And here's to another 250. Ex animo. Stella.
Next up, we have a very special treat for you. Some of you who have been longtime listeners of the Comicast know that in 2017, I introduced a segment called Monkey Watch. Now, unfortunately, it only lasted about 2 episodes, mostly because I forgot about it and it only lasted in 2 episodes. But the reality of it was, when it did occur, I guess people really enjoyed us talking about monkeys, or they just really, probably more likely was, they probably really enjoyed me talking about something that was nonsensical when it comes to stuff that has nothing to do with comics. So, in honor of the episode number 250 and our 10-year anniversary, I figured it might be best to bring back Monkey Watch. So, here's Monkey Watch 2018. And while, yes, I used the old intro, and that says 2017, which I'm sure someone will point out, I unfortunately was not able to put together a brand new one saying 2018. So, in honor of Monkey Watch 2018 and the 250th episode and the 10th anniversary of the website, we are going to actually, instead of talking about monkeys that have currently appeared in pop culture, we're going to talk about our favorite monkeys within pop culture. So first up, I'm going to throw it to Ed. Who is your favorite, or which monkey is your favorite in pop culture?
Well, I'm going to stick with the DC Comics theme of this, and I got to say mine's probably Grodd. He's been around in Flash comics forever, a larger part of the DC universe forever, and although you wouldn't think so, was actually used really, really well in the Flash TV show. So, sticking with the DC theme of the podcast, I'm going to go with Grodd.
Yeah, Grodd is definitely up there for me. The interesting thing about Grodd, especially in the TV shows, when Grodd appeared in The Flash, I was worried because there had been issues with the quality of some of the special effects on the show. Not
great all the time.
Yeah, it's not great all the time. It definitely has its moments, but when they introduced Grodd, I was really concerned because I was afraid. Not that they were going to have a guy walking around in a monkey suit, because I don't think any show nowadays would do that unless they were just doing it as a straight joke. But at the same time, I was concerned about how well it was going to look, and they did a decent job. And the really interesting thing is, Grodd continues to appear. It's not like it was just a one-off appearance, as there has been so many characters actually on the Flash TV show who have just had one or two appearances.
One and done.
And Grodd has been on the show multiple times, and then just this past season was on Legends of Tomorrow significantly a bunch of different times too. So yeah, I mean, I think I always liked Grodd in the Justice League and Justice League Unlimited series. I always liked that portrayal. I didn't really even know who Grodd was, I don't think, until the Justice League and Justice League Unlimited series, just because at that point I hadn't read a lot of other comics, and it was interesting to see this gorilla who is basically can control other gorillas and has this telepathic connection to people's brains, and it's kind of interesting. So, and he's popped up all over the place. He's in Justice League Action now. He's all over the place, but it's just kind of interesting.
He was in the video game.
Yeah, I forgot about that one. But yeah, Grodd is definitely up there, probably in my top 10.
What do you play Injustice as Grodd?
I have not.
Okay. I figured that'd be like right up your alley, though, right?
Yeah, the thing is, Grodd was introduced in Injustice 2, and I don't have Injustice 2. Like, I have Injustice 1 only because I got it free on the PlayStation now, and I hate to say that, but I don't buy every single video game that comes out, unless it is specifically Batman, but we haven't had any of those for a while now. But, yeah, Injustice I actually got free from PlayStation Now or Plus or whatever it was when I first signed up for PlayStation Plus. They it was like the game that they had at that time, and they did not have Grodd as a character you could have. I think it's just 2. So, yeah, I mean, eventually when it does make its way either to one of those ways of me getting it where I'm not paying $60 for a game that I hardly have time to play, then yeah, I definitely will be playing as Grodd.
As Grodd, fair enough.
All right, Stephanie, what is your favorite monkey?
I tend to have more of the Superboy from Young Justice attitude towards monkeys.
Okay.
Which is, I don't really like them, but if I had to pick one, from social media, from popular culture, it would probably be Winston from Overwatch.
Okay.
It's a video game.
I do know who that is.
Overwatch.
Yeah.
I don't even play it, but my husband plays him, and he's smart, and he has glasses, and he has a good backstory. Blizzard's put out a few YouTube videos of each character's backstory, and he's pretty interesting, and he's really cute, and he's a little tyke. And I don't know, that's cool, I guess. If I had to pick a monkey, my favorite real life monkey is the marmoset. Is the pygmy marmoset at the Dallas World Aquarium, because he is itty bitty and you can get right up close to him and watch him climb his little tree.
Yeah.
It's really cute.
I'm kind of taken aback by the fact that you don't like monkeys, but
I like her a lot. It's going well. Yeah.
Here's the thing. I don't actually like all monkeys. I actually just like chimps and gorillas, and orangutans are okay. But all the rest, I really don't like those little small monkeys. I
like the small monkeys. Yeah. I don't like the big monkeys. Yeah. I like lemurs and pygmy marmosets. And
yeah, my local zoo, there's a whole house, and it's basically the primate house, and you go through and like there's a specific area for animals from Africa. There's a specific animals for South America, specific area for animals from Asia. There's 3 different sections, and the gorillas, they have a bunch of gorillas, and they're not always, I mean, it's a setup thing, and it's been there for like 50 years, but the gorillas are at the very end of they're at the very end of the entire house. You got to go through the entire house to get to the gorillas, and my wife knows how much I can't stand like trying to look at the little monkeys that are hanging from the trees and stuff. And I'm just like, let's keep going. And like the moment of relief is there's a spot there where there's a family of orangutans, but you can almost never see them because they're always like hidden in the trees where they make their little nests and stuff. So you can't actually ever see them, and they're not very active. And quite honestly, gorillas aren't that active either. I mean, most of the gorillas aren't active, but currently they have like 2 small like toddlers, and they are always active and always, it doesn't matter what time of the day you go there, they're always like jumping around and hanging around, and their parents or the moms are always yelling at them. It's kind of fun. It reminds me of my household life. Okay, so as far as my favorite monkey, I know a lot of people out there know that I really like Detective Chimp, but that's specifically DC Comics. So if I had to pick a DC comic character, it would be Detective Chimp, mostly because he looks awesome in his Sherlock Holmes getup that he wears. It's just, I mean, like, I know it sounds ridiculous, but the idea of a monkey wearing clothes is awesome, and Gorilla Grodd is great and everything, but he's not wearing clothes. He the most he ever wears is armor or a helmet or something like that. So Detective Chimp, if it was DC Comics related. Now, pop culture, it's almost a toss-up between 2 specific characters. Caesar from the Planet of the Apes, the new trilogy of movies, not the classic ones. The classic ones, they don't really look like monkeys. They look like humans that became monkeys, because at the time, obviously, it was all about the makeup and making a person look like a monkey. The mocap stuff that they have now is insane, and Planet of the Apes movies, I mean, like, I honestly feel like those, the first movie, Rise of the Planet of the Apes, was like the point in time where I started to really enjoy monkeys. The other monkey that I like most of the time, depending on which movie you're looking at, is King Kong. Kong Skull Island last year was awesome and is exactly the way I would expect Kong to be portrayed. But that doesn't tend to happen. Sometimes, the portrayal of certain characters, whether it be Godzilla or something like that, it's not always the best. So that movie was great, in my opinion. And so, yeah, it would be a toss-up between King Kong and Caesar from Planet of the Apes. So,
have you considered owning a monkey?
Have I considered owning a monkey? No. I've never actually considered owning a monkey because I have actually watched a couple documentaries.
They have,
I know. Well, so going back to pre-Planet of the Apes, I remember in Friends, Joey had a monkey, and somebody, I don't remember if it was Joey, but somebody in that show, they had a monkey, and it was always walking around, and it was wearing diapers, and I kept thinking to myself, that thing looks ridiculous wearing diapers. Then I watched this documentary called Project Nim from 2011. If you like monkeys, I wouldn't suggest watching it because it is a sad movie. But there was a movie. It was about a monkey, a chimpanzee who was actually raised as a baby with a family, like a family of humans. The baby was taken away from its mother initially, and then it was raised by these humans as like a science experiment to see if they could get the chimp to actually adhere to human mannerisms and things like that. And eventually when the study ended, the scientist in charge was just like, okay, well, you're done. You can just go back, and they have a specific facility that they send all the monkeys that they've done tests on and stuff. And it was really not a good thing to watch if you enjoy and appreciate monkeys. But that was interesting because they when the chimp was really small, they did dress it up in clothes. The idea of that is kind of cool. I think I would prefer if I had a robotic monkey rather than an actual monkey, because the other problem is that they eventually do get vicious, and they don't have any control over it. It's just their nature, but eventually they get wild because they are wild animals. So
because they're monkeys,
yeah. So yeah, so that is Monkey Watch for this episode. As a ode to the continuance of Monkey Watch, I am pleased to announce that we will be continuing Monkey Watch going forward on the Comic Cast. Now, you may be asking yourselves, you're seriously going to talk about monkeys every episode? No, actually, we're not going to talk about monkeys. Because I randomly brought up monkeys, and at the time Stella gave me such an amount of grief for doing something that was so off book and out of character when it comes to my personality, we decided that we are going to have a discussion once an episode after Greater Gotham and before listener Q&As, where we talk about some random topic for 10-15 minutes, depending on whatever the topic is. We talk about something. It could be something that's news related to Batman that we don't normally talk about because it's not comic related. It might be comic book related. It might be not comic book DC Batman related at all. It could just be something that we want to talk about. So I mean, it's literally just the three of us talking about some sort of topic every episode, so that way you can get a little bit better understanding of different things and different ways we think of things instead of just having it strictly related to the comics. So hopefully everyone who is listening is interested in something like that. Obviously, if we get feedback that we suck, we will probably get rid of it. But for the time being, it's going to happen, and we've got some awesome ideas of stuff that we want to talk about. So look forward to that and immediately on the next episode, on episode number 251. So look forward to that. Next, let's dive into our final group of congrats messages.
This is Gordon, the homeless cop.
This is Penguin, the homeless penguin.
This is Ed, the homeless Riddler. We're here to represent the Gotham Chronicle podcast, the most homeless podcast on the BatmanUniverse.net. Congratulations on reaching 250 episodes. That's a lot. If I had that amount of dollars, maybe I'd be able to buy a hotel for the night. But alas, homeless cop.
Hello, Dustin and everyone over at the Batman Universe Comic Cast. This is Tim and Dane from the Bat Fans Podcast, and we wanted to take a quick second to give you guys a huge congratulations on reaching 250th episodes. I mean, that's a whole lot of episodes, and I think it's a whole lot of comics to review as well. So, no easy feat, but it's a job well done, and we just wanted to, send over our congratulations to you guys on such a big accomplishment.
Yeah, I wonder how many actual comics they've reviewed in 250 episodes.
That is a good question, and that would be interesting to find out, because I'm sure there is tons of amazing comics and stories they got to review, but also a lot of not so good issues as well. But it all made for, I'm sure, 250 very entertaining episodes. So congratulations, guys, from us at the Bat Fans Podcast, and here's to 250 more.
Hi, Dustin and everyone from TBU. This is Chris.
And this is Jerry from Bat Books for Beginners.
We just wanted to congratulate you on your 250th episode.
What an amazing accomplishment for a great podcast.
Here is to 250 more.
So finally, our last segment, we have the panel of myself, Ed, Steph, and Josh. We are going to be talking about comic things that we wish we covered. Now, this could be basically anything. So over the years, we've covered a number of different events and comic stories and series and all kinds of stuff. Years ago, when we started the comic podcast, we were actually starting out right on the tail end of Batman R.I.P., going in Battle for the Cowl. We did Flashpoint, New 52, Court of Owls, all the crossovers that happened with that, Death of the Family, all kinds of stuff, Rebirth, Convergence. Unfortunately, we've covered a lot of stuff over the years, but there has been plenty of stuff. Eventually, they got to a point where we had to start trimming books out because there was just too many books. Josh was around back when we covered all of the books, but afterwards, after we split and we started going twice, we had 2 episodes per month. We ended up starting to cut out some of the stuff, and eventually, then we brought back a bunch of it for the 0.5 cast. But that only lasted for so long because those books were just really, really bad.
I was developing a drinking habit.
Yes, but over the years, basically what has happened is that because of the horrific nature of some of the New 52 stuff, because we cut some of that stuff, it's kind of streamlined what we do cover. And as you know, now we just cover Batman and Detective Comics, occasionally something else, but most of the time it's just Batman and Detective Comics. And occasionally we do a special where we cover a story arc or a mini series or something like that. And I'm hoping to do more of those in the near future. It's just a matter of getting the time to set those reviews up and things like that. But the point of this segment is I want us all to basically say something that we wish the Comic Cast would have covered. Now, this could have been some of you who have been around for a long time, something that you wish that you were able to cover being part of the Comic Cast, or it could be something that you wish the Comic Cast as a whole would have covered at some point, whether or not it was you or not. Or it could have been something where it was like, for example, just as an example, it could be something like Batman White Knight, where it is clearly Batman related. It's clearly doing very well in sales and critically acclaimed. You just wish that we would have covered something like that on a monthly basis rather than collecting as a whole or something like that. It could also be something from the past. I mean, if you really want to pull some sort of, you really wish we covered the issue of Batman where it was, which introduced Zebra Batman. I mean, more power to you. So basically, we're just going to go one by one and talk about something that we really wish the Comic Cast would have covered at some point within the 80 years of Batman's existence. So, Steph, which book would you have preferred the Comic Cast to cover?
My choice, since I'm newer around the Batman universe, and usually what I hear about is stuff you guys talk about on the Comic Cast, so I wasn't around for any of that, is Super Sons. I love Damian. Damian's one of my favorite DC characters, and Jonathan is just a little ray of sunshine. This boy needs to stop being his dad and being so grumpy all the time. And so it just kind of reminds me of like if Dustin Nguyen made a little Gotham series of Batman and Superman, it would be these 2 little kids. So it just makes me so happy, and it's cute, but it's still, they still have cool adventures, and Damian is still Damian and Jonathan is still Jonathan, but I just really enjoy it and kind of wish there was something covering that either on the podcast or something. I know you guys do the reviews and stuff, but that would be cool.
Yeah, Super Sons, I think, was one of the lightest toned books that we've had in the New 52 that we as TBU cover on the website. And I've enjoyed Super Sons. I mean, there's been a couple story arcs where I think they lost their footing, but Super Sons as a whole, I think, has kind of been an interesting pairing. I mean, initially when it was announced that it was going to be Superboy and Damian, I was like, clearly they're just going for a world's finest book, and they're just featuring these characters because Damian doesn't have anywhere to go at this point, or he's only in Teen Titans. But it's actually been an enjoyable series, and I've enjoyed it. So
I like it that it's given Damian a platform or a book to develop, and he isn't just been left, to sit and be the son of Batman until they need him. Like, he's actually becoming a different person, and that's
cool. And in a lot of ways, he's actually developing a more significant rate than over in Teen Titans, because Teen Titans has to focus on so many characters that there's not a whole lot of focus on. And the exact same thing happened with Tim Drake during the New 52. I mean, Tim Drake, there was very little movement on his character whatsoever, because when it comes to the teen books, you don't have the opportunity to focus on a character too much. But a book like Super Sons, where it's only really two characters that they're focused on, you can really build the characters, both characters, because there's the ability and time to do it. So,
and the banter is so great in that book.
It's a good book. Wonderful. It is. I almost don't mind that some of the stories kind of lose themselves, because there's still Jonathan and Damian trying to figure things out, and the relationship is what makes the books worth it, I think.
Okay, so Ed, what was one of your issues or series or whatever that you would have preferred we covered?
So this is kind of difficult. I don't have a particular one, but I have a particular concept that'll make hopefully sense here in a minute. So my thing is anniversaries of stories, I should say. So, like, we weren't all together. We didn't have the band together when Arkham Asylum came out, or when No Man's Land came out, or Nightfall came out, right? But when we have, like, Arkham had its 25th anniversary a year ago, or No Man's Land celebrated its 15th year, or whatever it is, I always thought it'd be fun on Present Day Comic Cast, when you have those anniversaries of Killing Joke, the big seminal stories. I've always thought it was something that we don't have to do like an issue by issue thing. Like, this is No Man's Land issue number 46, but just in brief, kind of look back at the stories of the past and see, do they still add up as it relates to the modern comic cast? You know what I mean? Like, does No Man's Land still matter? Is Arkham Asylum still have a place? Like, I've always thought not covering those anniversaries, because we can't go back and cover everything. It would take forever. So doing it like that, I've often thought would be an interesting way. And I think sometimes when I see, like, oh, here's the 25th anniversary of I don't remember this one because it was on my shelf, which is what sparked this. Here's the 25th anniversary of Arkham. And you go, I really wish we could have covered that. And then I think, well, why couldn't we just cover the anniversary? Like, we're so busy. I get that. But that's what I think I kind of miss is looking at those older stories that I think are so beloved and so classic and have such a place in the history. And kind of being able to talk about them in a modern context. Like, are these things still relatable? That's just the one thing that I've always kind of wished we would do.
Yeah, I would not. I think that's. I wish there was. I wish there would be something we could do too. And it really. And I say this all the time, but I mean, it really just comes down to time. Yeah. I mean, the problem is that there are so many moving parts when it comes to the site, not just the comic cast. There's so many moving parts to try to remember when the anniversaries are. Sometimes, like, an anniversary comes and goes. I mean, I made the mistake myself back in January when the anniversary of TBU, I forgot it. I thought it was at the end of the month. It turned out it was at the beginning of the month. I was completely unaware that it was actually earlier, just because I didn't go back and actually check to see when it was, because I just had too much going on. So I missed it by like 3 weeks. But I mean, it wasn't like I was doing anything specifically special because on that date. So it just happened. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, I like the idea of the concepts of covering the older stories, and especially as like a story as a whole, not like an individual.
You don't get to break them down.
Issue or a synopsis, because people who have read these issues know what they are. But yes, the idea of doing something where it is a take on, does this story still stand true with the test of time over all of these years, however long it's been. I know. I mean, this is kind of we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of No Man's Land.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's a good concept that just might happen.
There you go.
All right, Josh, what do you got?
So for mine, my idea, it would be funny if in some like alternate timeline where like Barry Allen saved his parents or something, the timeline is all screwed up, that for some reason we have like the internet and podcast in the 80s and we're all like, around in our current ages in the 80s, and we were covering in 1987 Batman Year One on the Comic Cast. Not because I think that we'd like it and have a good time. I think we would hate it because, like, coming off as longtime Batman readers, and then, like, Crisis happens, like, and then, like, we read a year later Batman Year One, we'd be like, wait a second, Catwoman's a hooker? Frank Miller, you can't do this to Catwoman. She's not a hooker, like, she was just fighting crime with Batman over in, I'm trying to remember who wrote those issues right before. It was like Conway, but someone took over for Conway afterwards. But
just blame it on Brayfogle. That's what we do.
Yeah, Doug Mensch or someone. Like, it's like Catwoman was fighting crime. Now you're saying she was a hooker, and then wait, what the heck? Alfred didn't even meet Bruce Wayne until Dick Grayson was already living with him. Now they're saying Alfred was there from the beginning, and what? Commissioner Gordon would never cheat on his wife because, like, in the old books, Gordon was just this like stoic character who like would light the bat signal. But in Year One, he's like cheating on his wife and like the Gotham City Police Department isn't corrupt. And like, wait a second, they have a baby boy at the end named James. Where's Tony? And if they have a baby boy, where's Barbara Gordon? They just retcon Batgirl. Now Batman family's not even in continuity. Screw you, Frank Miller. This is the worst comic ever. Like, I think that would be so much fun, and we'd lose our minds like so quickly on the show.
You're probably right, by the way, because you talk about New 52 changing things to some extent. Year One really changed things.
And it's held up over time, and it's a classic story, but I can just imagine being like a Batman continuity nut, and we'd be like, I don't understand. Where's Barbara Gordon Jr.? Like she doesn't exist now? There's never been a Batgirl, and like Catwoman's a whore, and Gordon cheats on his wife? Like, whose idea was this?
Yeah, I think that I definitely agree. I think at the time, if in that time frame, we probably would have hated it, probably just as much as some of the stuff we hated at the beginning of the New 52 because it was such a drastic change from what we had. It would probably be like comparing what we were doing with Batgirl, Stephanie Brown, to Batgirl, Gail Simone's run at the New 52. That's the easiest comparison I could probably make between the two for something we'd actually covered, where it went from we really enjoyed something to it is just horrific. Okay, so mine, there's a couple different things I wish we would have covered over the years. I mean, I've been doing this for 10 years, but there is a lot of stuff that I have always wished that we had covered to some degree, or even so let me just go through. So my thing has always, and if you're a longtime listener, you know that I've always really appreciated and loved the aspect of the Bat family. I love that like the idea of Batman is a great character, but what makes Batman for me is the fact that he surrounds himself with a surrogate family, and he has all these other supporting characters: Nightwing, Robin, Red Hood, Batgirl, Cassandra Cain, Stephanie with Spoiler. I mean, there's all kinds of characters over the years that he's surrounded himself with, and he has such a rich universe when it comes. I mean, there's a reason why the website is called the Batman Universe, and it's not just the Batman site, because the thing is, there's so many characters within that universe, and in my opinion, it's one of the richest characters out there. I know there are other characters that people can compare, have a very rich universe and things like that when it comes to a specific character, not like the DC universe or the Marvel universe, but there are some characters out there. And I know Spider-Man, I would say Spider-Man has a very good group of characters surrounding his character too. But I think my thing has always been, I love the fact that there's all of these characters, and it also goes down to like the villains. bar none, I believe that Batman has the best rogues gallery of any character out there. And I honestly have always loved the stories that feature a ton of characters. And over the years, we've covered some. One of my favorite stories that we've covered here on the podcast was Batman Battle for the Cowl, because it involves so many different characters, and then the fallout from that. And then it's just encompassing, and it brings everything together, and it does it. And it goes back to the comics that I first initially read as a comic book reader, which was Batman No Man's Land, which I've said multiple times in the past. It's my favorite comic story, and that's because outside of the fact that it was my first major comic story event that I read, it just repeatedly covers one character after another character after another. You see all these different points of view. You see everything that's happening with every character dealing with this specific event. It encompasses all of the series and things like that. And the New 52 wiped the idea of that away, and they've had crossovers and things like that, but they're not anywhere near the same as what they used to be. And overall, I just really appreciate it. So thinking of what I've loved in what aspects of Batman I love, which is the Batman universe and the Batman family and the Rogues Gallery, I really wish we were around to cover Batman Hush at the time. It's one of the stories that features a number of characters. Obviously, No Man's Land. There's Nightfall. Also, these big, giant, huge events that just encompass all of the Batman series, whether or not it's Robin, Nightwing, Batman, Shadow of the Bat, Legends of the Dark Knight. All of these series that we're releasing, they all are included in these massive events. And that's the kind of stuff that I really love, because you can tell a comic story, and we've talked about this on the normal episodes. When we talk about a series, and they talk even twice a month with Batman, for example, there are things that are not happening in the series that you would expect to happen, but for whatever reason, it's happening in off-panel world. I honestly feel like back in the day with No Man's Land, with Nightfall, there were so many different series happening and so many different writers that were having input on different points of view of certain characters. It's almost impossible to worry about anything that is happening in off-panel land, because there's so much happening in just a short time. I mean, like back in a given month during Nightfall or No Man's Land, there was at least 6 to 8 ongoings per month as part of the Batman universe that were happening, and all of them were tied in some way to what was happening with these giant story arcs. And those things I've always really, really appreciated and really enjoyed. And those are some of the things I wish we would cover, and maybe someday in the future we will cover some of those storylines outside of the ways we have covered some of them. I mean, we have covered some of them in Bat Books for Beginners, or some of the other podcasts that are on the network actually have covered some of them too. But in general, there's a lot of stuff out there that is like that. And Battle for the Cowl, I think, was one of the things that I was super excited about because of how in depth it was, and a lot of the stuff pre-Flashpoint, on like with Bruce Wayne returning in the road home and all those tie-ins and all that stuff. As much as there was a ton of it, I've always loved when there's a ton of stuff that all ties in together. So that's the kind of stuff that I wished we could see more of. Maybe we will see more of it. I mean, next month we have, or as you're listening to this, the preludes are happening with the wedding, but I'm not sure how much they're tying in. But at the same time, you have books like Nightwing and Batgirl and Red Hood, and none of them are really referencing the wedding coming up at all. And it's kind of annoying that happens. But back in the 90s and the early 2000s, everybody was referencing everything going on in all the books. And I just wish we had a little bit more of a connected universe. And I know New 52 was all about separating stuff and making it so that you didn't have to read everything, and that's fine, but it just comes down to just easily putting in the editor's note. And if anything, that's a cross promotion, because saying, oh, if you want to know more about what this person just said, check out this other issue, which might make you go to buy that other issue. So, yep, that's the stuff I like. I wish we covered. So finally, before we wrap up, I just want to say one final thank you. And that's to you, the listener. You guys have been here for the last 10 years and have been listening to our podcasts. not just this podcast, but all the podcasts that we offer on the BatmanUniverse.net. You have supported us in a wide variety of ways. Some of you have volunteered your time and become staff and become co-hosts. And some of you just listen and write in your comments. And those comments, they are extremely helpful in coming up with discussion points and things like that. But most of all, it's important for us to know that you guys are there. That you guys are listening and that you enjoy what we are doing and that we are doing something that's worthwhile for other Bat fans out there. So thank you for the last 10 years, and we greatly appreciate all of the support that you guys have given us, whether it be through your comments, whether it be through your emails, whether it be through your volunteering of your time, whether it be through your PayPal donations or your support for us on Patreon. We greatly appreciate all the support that all of our listeners have given us. So thank you so much to all of our listeners, and trust me when I say TBU is going to be doing a lot more for you guys in the very near future. So as we wrap up, I just want to remind everybody, as I always do on every episode, be sure to check us out over at thebatmanuniverse.net. Check out all the latest movie, TV, merchandise, video game, and comic news that we have to offer every single week over on the site. In addition to that, check out all the reviews and original content that we have to offer. All of the other podcasts that we have that you guys can check out and take a listen to. If you have a specific character that you are super interested in, chances are we have a podcast for it. So take a look at thebatmanuniverse.net. Be sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube for all the latest news and videos from the Batman Universe. Leave your comments in the comment section. Specifically for this episode, because this is an anniversary episode, we probably won't be able to answer questions per se, but I can trust me when I say we will definitely read all of your questions or all your comments. So if you'd like to wish us happy 250th, happy 10th anniversary, those are always greatly appreciated. But please just take the moment to head over to the site and leave a comment. If you're listening to this on YouTube, leave a comment on YouTube. If you're listening to this on any avenue whatsoever, send us an email at tbu@thebatmanuniverse.net and just let us know how long you've been listening and whether or not you enjoy what you get. I mean, obviously, I hope you all enjoy what we're doing, but and that's why you continue to listen. But honestly, hearing from our fans is more important than pretty much anything else. DC can continue to put out good stuff. They could switch and we could revert back to the New 52 continuity and have nothing but crap. But the reality is if you guys are supporting us, we'll be here. So thank you again for everything. This is Dustin, and you guys have been listening to the 250th episode of the Batman Universe Comic Podcast. We'll see you guys next time.